And a man kneels in the dust at the edge of a village road, and the bowl in his hands has a crack running straight through its base. It is the dry season in northern India, centuries before anyone will think to call this era ancient. The road is the color of old bone. Heat presses down on the crowd that has gathered here, and it is a crowd hundreds deep, pressed shoulder to shoulder, craning forward to see a man who has just made fire leap from his open palm. None of them have stopped in this moment to question what they are actually watching, or why it has pulled them so completely away from whatever they were doing only minutes before. You can hear them before you can see what they're watching. A low murmur rising. Someone near the back stands on a cartwheel to get a better view. A mother lifts her child onto her shoulders. You feel the heat of all those bodies pressed together. The dust kicked up by sandaled feet, a particular electricity of a crowd that believes it is witnessing something wholly certain in this moment, that whatever is happening in front of them deserves every bit of the attention they are giving it. And performing the fire trick wears robes dyed a color no ordinary ascetic could afford. His hair is matted into elaborate locks. He speaks slowly, deliberately, the way men speak when they have learned that pauses make people lean in. He tells the crowd he has touched the gods. He tells them suffering ends the moment they believe him completely. He tells them what they want to hear, and he tells it beautifully. Listen to the actual shape of what he says, because the specific words matter more than the fire trick itself. He does not tell the crowd they must work for years to understand suffering. None. He tells them suffering has already ended the moment they accept him, here, now, today. He does not ask them to look honestly at their own minds. He asks them to look at him instead, not transfer the difficult work of self-examination onto a figure who promises to carry that weight on their behalf. This is, in its own way, the oldest trick in this entire story, dressed up in whatever century's particular costume happens to be available. The promise that someone else's certainty can substitute for your own clarity. That belief alone, directed at the right object, can do the work that patient understanding was always going to require. And here's what most people miss. What almost nobody in that crowd notices, because their eyes are fixed on the fire. Behind the spectacle, on the far edge of the road, a second man walks past, alone. No followers, no fire, no matted hair, no fine robes, nothing to look at twice. He carries a single bowl, and the bowl is cracked. Nobody turns to watch him go. Why would they? There is nothing happening over there. No flame, no promise, no performance. Just a man walking toward the edge of town with a broken bowl and an unremarkable face, disappearing into the heat shimmer at the road's end, the way countless quiet figures have disappeared at the edge of countless crowds, in every century, without anyone ever bothering to ask where they were actually going. You will want to remember him. We will come back to him. Not yet, but soon enough. This is a story about why crowds gather around fire and walk past quiet men with cracked bowls, and why 25 centuries later, the same pattern still repeats itself in every village, every city, every feed you scroll through before bed. It is a story the Buddha told his own students directly, because he watched it happen in his own lifetime, inside his own community, among people who had every reason to know better. It is worth being honest from this very first chapter about why this pattern has never once faded with the passing of centuries, despite how thoroughly it has been described, analyzed, and warned against. Knowing about a pattern in the abstract never been the same as recognizing it the moment it appears wearing a new disguise in your own life. You are about to spend a long time in this story watching other people fall for versions of this same trap, century after century. And it would be easy, watching from this comfortable distance, to assume you would have seen through each disguise immediately, standing where they stood. This story asks something harder of you instead, not simply to recognize the pattern in others, safely removed by time and distance, but to keep asking, chapter by chapter, where in your own life the same fire might currently be burning unnoticed, simply because it has not yet occurred to you to look for it there. So let's be precise about what this is not. This is not a story about which temple draws the bigger crowd. This is not a story about who has the more impressive title, the louder voice, the more convincing performance. This is not a story about popularity at all. Not. This is a story about why the popular path and the true path are so rarely the same path, and why the difference between them is something you can learn to feel in your own chest, long before you can explain it in words. And here's the part nobody tells you at the start of a teaching like this. The Buddha did not discover that people prefer comfort to truth. Every teacher who came before him already suspected as much, and what he discovered and described with uncomfortable precision is why. Not a vague moral about laziness, a mechanism, a specific, repeatable pattern in the human mind that pulls people toward the wide road and away from the narrow one every single time, unless something interrupts it. Pay attention to this, and because it will explain almost everything that follows in this story. The mind, the Buddha taught, runs ahead of every state we experience. In the opening lines of the Dhammapada, he put it as simply as language allows. Mind is the forerunner of all things. What the mind dwells on, it becomes. A mind clouded by craving and aversion will build almost automatically a world full of wide roads. A mind that has learned to see clearly will notice the narrow ones, even when no one else does. This single idea is the foundation everything else stands on. So hold it. We'll return to it more than once. Consider what this actually implies about every story this video is about to show you. If mind genuinely runs ahead of every state we experience, then the crowd gathered around the fire trick teacher was not simply making a poor decision about where to direct their attention. Their minds had already been shaped by years of craving and fear to find that particular kind of promise irresistible long before they ever arrived at that dusty road. The same is true in reverse. The quiet man with the cracked bowl was not simply choosing, in that single moment, to walk past the spectacle unmoved. Years of patient inner work had already shaped a mind capable of walking past it without needing to look. Neither the crowd's susceptibility nor the quiet man's indifference appeared from nowhere in that instant. Both were the visible result of habits of mind cultivated, one way or another, long before that afternoon ever began. Let's go back to that crowd on the dusty road, because there is something underneath their fascination worth naming honestly. They are not stupid. You would not have been stupid standing among them. Almost no one standing in that crowd was a fool or lazy or careless about their own suffering. Many of them were desperate. Many of them had buried children. Many of them had been promised relief their entire lives and never received it. They were starving for something to work. And the fire trick teacher offered them something that felt like it was working immediately. That is the trap. And it is worth sitting with for a moment before we move forward. Counterfeit teachings rarely fail because they are obviously false. They succeed because they are immediately satisfying. A wide road does not announce itself as wrong. It announces itself as easy, and easy feels, in the moment, indistinguishable from true. There is a woman in this crowd you should know. Her name is Kisa Gotami, and she is not here by accident. A short time before this scene, Kisa Gotami's only child died. A small boy, not yet old enough to walk steadily on his own. Grief like that does not behave the way grief behaves in stories. It does not arrive, peak, and pass. It arrives and refuses to leave the room. Kisa Gotami carried her dead son from house to house through her village, begging anyone, a healer, a priest, a stranger with a kind face, for medicine that could bring him back. You can imagine what that looked like if you have ever loved someone you could not save. The neighbors who looked away, the ones who offered pity instead of help, which is its own kind of cruelty. the desperate hope that flared every time someone hesitated instead of saying no outright, because hesitation, to a grieving mind, looks exactly like possibility. She has heard, like everyone else in this crowd, that there is a man nearby who can perform miracles. That is why she stands here today, child still in her arms, waiting for the fire-eyed teacher to notice her and tell her what she has traveled here praying to hear. That he can fix what death has broken. She has walked 3 days to reach this village. You should know what those 3 days looked like because they tell you something about how far grief like hers is willing to travel on the strength of a single rumor. She slept the first night under a tamarind tree with her son's body wrapped against her chest, the way she had carried him when he was alive and sleepy after a long afternoon. She did not eat the second day. Not because there was no food offered to her. Strangers gave her rice, gave her water, gave her the careful, frightened kindness people give to someone whose grief makes them afraid. But because eating felt, to her, like agreeing that life would simply continue, and she was not ready to agree to that yet. By the second night, people in the villages she passed through had begun to recognize her by description before she even arrived. The woman with the dead child, the mother who will not put him down. Word travels faster than grief-stricken feet, and so by the time she reached the outskirts of this village, a few kind, exhausted strangers were already waiting to tell her, gently, that there was nothing more to be done. And a few others, the ones whose own faith ran towards spectacle rather than patience, were already telling her about the teacher who had just arrived nearby, the one people said could heal anything, raise anyone, undo even what seemed most permanently undone. You can guess which version of the news she chose to believe. Grief this large does not weigh competing reports evenly. It reaches almost involuntarily for whichever story still leaves a door open. Keep this image in mind. We'll return to her much further into this story, at a moment when grief finally teaches her something fire tricks never could. Now, here's where the story turns away from this village, and toward the man who will spend the rest of his life explaining exactly why crowds behave this way, and why the harder path almost never looks like the right one in the moment you're standing at the fork. His name, before any of the titles history would later give him, was Siddhartha Gautama. By the time of this scene, he has already left a palace, already starved himself nearly to death trying the opposite extreme, already discovered that neither indulgence nor punishment frees a human mind from suffering. He has found something else instead, a middle way, deliberately unglamorous, built on ordinary disciplines sustained over years rather than miraculous shortcuts performed in an afternoon. You should understand what those years actually cost him, because the cost matters for everything this story is about to show you. He did not arrive at this teaching through a single flash of insight handed to him easily, and he spent years first in the opposite extreme from the palace he had left, fasting until his ribs showed clearly through skin gone thin as parchment, until, by his own later description, he could press a hand against his stomach and feel his spine on the other side of it. He nearly died this way, more than once, convinced that the answer to suffering must lie in punishing the body that seemed to generate so much of it. It did not work, and here is the detail worth sitting with, because it is the first quiet warning this story offers about extremes dressed up as devotion. Starving himself half to death did not bring him any closer to the truth he was searching for. It brought him closer to death, nothing else. He had to abandon an entire identity, the identity of the most extreme ascetic among his companions, a kind of status he had earned through years of visible suffering, in order to admit that the suffering itself had taught him nothing except how to suffer more skillfully. He does not perform fire tricks. He does not promise instant relief. What he offers instead is something the Pali language names with painful accuracy, dukkha, not simply suffering in the dramatic sense, not only grief or pain, but the subtle, grinding unsatisfactoriness that runs underneath even our happiest, most secure moments. the itch beneath comfort, the quiet unease that something is still missing, even when everything looks fine from the outside. This is a harder thing to sell than miracles. You cannot put dukkha on display the way you can put fire on display. You cannot gather a crowd around the careful, patient work of seeing your own mind clearly. This, right here, is the first crack in the wide road that almost no one in that village crowd will ever notice. The easy path is easy precisely because it never asks you to look directly at dukkha. It distracts from it, numbs it, performs around it. The narrow path does the opposite. It asks you to sit with the ache until you finally understand what's causing it. Think for a moment about how this shows up in your own life, 25 centuries removed from that village road. The endless scroll that promises distraction from a feeling you haven't named yet. The purchase that promises satisfaction lasting slightly longer than the last one did, though somehow it never quite does. The relationship you stay in, or the one you avoid starting, because the discomfort of examining what you actually want feels larger than the discomfort of simply not looking. None of these are fire tricks in the literal sense. All of them are the same mechanism, wearing different clothing, offering the same old promise. Relief without examination. Yet, comfort without the harder work dukkha is quietly asking you to do. Stay with me here because this next part is the hinge the entire video turns on. If the wide road and the narrow road both promised relief from suffering, and only one of them actually delivered it, you would expect people to eventually notice the difference and migrate toward what works. That is not what happens. Not in that village. Not in the centuries that follow. Not, if you're honest with yourself, in your own life either. Why not? Because the wide road delivers something real, just not the thing it claims to deliver. It delivers belonging. It delivers the relief of not standing alone. It delivers the comfort of being told by hundreds of voices at once that you are doing the right thing. These are not nothing. Belonging is one of the oldest, most powerful forces shaping human behavior. The Buddha understood this centuries before anyone had a name for social conformity. He simply called it correctly. People are drawn to what is easy to see, easy to do, easy to be praised for, and the praise of many voices feels, to a frightened mind, almost indistinguishable from truth. The narrow road offers no such comfort. Walking it often means walking without applause. It can mean walking without anyone watching at all. Which brings us back one last time before we leave this chapter to the man with the cracked bowl. You didn't get his name. Neither did the crowd. None. He passed through that village unremarked, unrecorded by anyone standing near the fire that day. And he is not a metaphor invented for this video. He represents something the historical record keeps circling back to again and again across centuries of Buddhist texts. The quiet practitioner walking the harder road, leaving no trace the crowd thinks worth noticing. Here's the part nobody tells you about people like him. None. History is written by what gets noticed. Spectacle gets recorded. Quiet, sustained discipline almost never does. Not at the moment it's happening. Which means every story like this one has to work backward. Finding the few threads where someone somewhere eventually noticed the quiet ones too. 40 years from now, in a part of this story we have not reached yet, someone will notice him. We are not there yet, but we will get there. And for now, what matters is the shape of the question this whole video is built to answer. The one the Buddha kept returning to across decades of teaching, in village after village, very much like this one. If the wide road leads nowhere lasting and the narrow road leads somewhere real, why does almost everyone still choose the wide one? The answer begins, as it always does in this tradition, inside the mind itself. In three forces so old and so universal that the earliest texts gave them names that have outlived empires. We're about to meet them, and once you see them clearly, you will start noticing them everywhere. In that crowd, in that grieving mother, in the quiet man with the cracked bowl, and, if you're honest, somewhere closer to home than you might expect. Three forces, one mind, and an entire history of crowds and quiet roads still waiting to unfold from here. By now you've stood in that crowd, felt the heat of the fire trick, and watched a quiet man with a cracked bowl disappear past the edge of the village unnoticed, stunned. But the question underneath all of that, why the wide road draws so many feet and the narrow one draws so few, has not been answered yet. It begins, oddly enough, in a deer park outside a city called Varanasi, with 5 men who have already failed at finding the truth once. You should picture them honestly. 5 ascetics, gaunt from years of self-starvation, sitting beneath a stand of trees and watching a 6th man approach, a man they had recently abandoned, believing he had given up the search for truth the moment he stopped torturing his own body. They expect, when they see him walking toward them, that he has come to rejoin their old practice, exhausted and defeated. It is worth understanding why these 5 men had chosen self-starvation in the first place, because the choice was not arbitrary cruelty toward themselves. And in the religious landscape of their time, severe austerity was widely respected as evidence of spiritual seriousness. The more visibly a person suffered for truth, the more credible their search appeared to others, and, just as importantly, to themselves. These 5 men had built years of identity around being among the most extreme practitioners of this approach, admired by other seekers precisely for how far they had taken it. And when the man they had practiced beside for years suddenly abandoned that path, choosing instead to eat enough food to sustain a clear mind, it would have looked, by every standard they had built their lives around, like exactly the kind of failure of will their own continued suffering was supposed to prove they did not have. He has not come to rejoin anything. He has come to teach them something none of them expected, that the answer was never in starving the body or indulging it. It was somewhere between the two, on a road so unglamorous it had never occurred to any of them to walk it. It is worth sitting briefly with why a road sitting between 2 extremes should feel so much harder to commit to than either extreme on its own. Extremes, in their own way, offer a kind of clarity that moderation rarely does. Total indulgence has a clear, simple logic. Pursue pleasure, avoid discomfort. Total austerity has an equally clear logic, inverted. Pursue discomfort, distrust pleasure. Both extremes, however punishing, at least offer a person a stable, unambiguous rule to organize their life around. The middle way offers no such simplicity. It asks for continuous, situational judgment, neither indulging nor punishing, but discerning, moment by moment, what a particular situation actually calls for, with no fixed rule available to settle the question in advance. This is perhaps the quietest reason the narrow road draws so few people relative to either extreme. A fixed rule, however harsh, is simply easier to follow than ongoing discernment, even when the discernment leads somewhere far more livable. You can imagine the suspicion on their faces. These were serious men. They had given years to a punishing discipline, and now a man who had quietly walked away from that same discipline was telling them the entire premise had been wrong from the start. If you have ever had to admit that years of effort were aimed in the wrong direction, you already know how heavy that moment is. It is one of the hardest doors a human mind ever has to open. 4 of the 5 sat with that discomfort and could not yet walk through it. Here's the part most retellings rush past. Only one of them did. You should know their names too, even if their stories move slower than Kondanna's. Vapa, Badia, Mahanama, and Asaji sat in that same circle, heard those same words, and felt something stir without yet breaking fully open. None of them argued. None of them walked away in anger, the way you might expect men whose life's work had just been quietly contradicted. They simply needed more explanation, more repetition, more time spent sitting with discomfort before the fog covering their own minds thinned enough to let clarity through. Over the following days, one by one, each of them would reach the same understanding Kondanna reached that first afternoon. But not that day. Not in front of everyone, the way Kondanna's understanding arrived. His name was Kondanna, and what happened to him in that deer park is worth slowing down for, because it is the first recorded moment of someone choosing the narrow road in real time, in front of witnesses, against his own prior conviction. And as the teaching unfolded, the middle way, the truth of dissatisfaction, the truth that this dissatisfaction has a cause, that the cause can end, and that there is a path to end it. Something in Kondanna simply opened, not slowly, not after years of additional struggle. He understood immediately, with a clarity the texts describe as dust falling away from his eyes. The other four did not feel what he felt. Not yet. They needed more time, more teaching, more of the same patient repetition before the same understanding reached them. And this matters more than it first appears to. Even among 5 men sitting in the exact same circumstance, now, hearing the exact same words, the narrow road did not open for all of them at once. Some people need to hear a true thing many times before it becomes load-bearing inside them. Some people need to hear it only once. Neither is a failure. Both are simply how a mind, clouded in different degrees by old habits, comes to clarity at its own pace. This is the Pali word worth sitting with here. Magga, the path, not a single doorway you either walk through or don't, but a road with a direction, walked one honest step at a time at whatever pace your own mind allows. It is worth pausing on what this actually means for anyone who has ever compared their own progress unfavorably to someone else's. The temptation, watching Kondanna's instant clarity beside the other 4 ascetics' slower understanding, is to conclude that some people are simply built for awakening and others are not. A comforting, fatalistic story that quietly excuses anyone who has not yet experienced their own moment of sudden clarity. The texts themselves resist this conclusion directly. Vapa, Badya, Mahanama, Asaji, each eventually reach full understanding just as completely as Kondanna had, simply along a road that required more steps to walk. The destination did not differ based on the pace of arrival, and only the road's length differed. And length, this story keeps insisting, has never been evidence of failure. There's a detail easy to miss in this scene, and it's the kind of detail that explains a great deal about why so few people ultimately walk this road compared to how many briefly consider it. The teaching the Buddha gave that day was not impressive to look at. There was no fire, no miracle, just 4 true statements about suffering and a description of 8 ordinary practices. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. None of which promise instant transformation. None of which can be performed for a crowd in an afternoon. Consider for a moment how unglamorous as each of 8 practices actually sounds when stripped of any spiritual mystique. Right speech means, in practical terms, simply not lying, not gossiping maliciously, not speaking harshly when calm words would do. Right livelihood means earning a living without causing direct, deliberate harm to others. Right effort means noticing when an unhelpful state of mind has arisen and gently working to release it again and again for as long as it takes. None of this sounds like the kind of thing that draws a crowd. It sounds not, if anything, like the description of an unusually careful, ordinary life, which is precisely the point this entire video keeps returning to. The narrow road has never disguised itself as exotic. Its difficulty has always come from its sheer, sustained ordinariness, practiced patiently long after the initial appeal of ordinary done extraordinarily well has worn off and only the discipline itself remains. If you had walked past that deer park as a stranger that day, you would have seen 6 unremarkable men sitting under some trees talking quietly. Nothing about the scene would have told you that something enormous had just happened inside one of them. This is the pattern you should start watching for throughout the rest of this story. The most important moments on the narrow road almost never look important from the outside. They look like nothing at all. Now let's walk forward several years to a much quieter moment and to a young man named Ananda, because Ananda's story shows you the other half of what it cost to walk this road honestly. Ananda became the Buddha's closest attendant, the man who would spend decades at his side, carrying water, fetching robes, standing guard outside his door during illness, remembering, with what the tradition credits as near-total recall, nearly every teaching the Buddha ever gave in his presence. From the outside, this looks like the easiest seat in the entire story. Proximity to the teacher, constant access to wisdom, a front-row view of awakening itself. You should picture what an ordinary day in that seat actually looked like, because the texts preserve enough detail to make it vivid. Ananda woke before dawn to sweep the path leading to the teacher's quarters. He carried the alms bowl on long walking journeys between cities, in heat that left other monks resting in whatever shade they could find. He stood more than once between the Buddha and people who meant him harm, including an attempt on his life involving a released elephant driven deliberately into his path. None of this looked from outside like spiritual struggle. It looked like service. And service, performed faithfully for decades, can quietly disguise the fact that the person performing it has not yet finished their own inner work, sometimes even from the person performing it. Here's what almost nobody tells you about that seat. Proximity is not the same thing as arrival. Ananda walked beside enlightenment for decades and did not, himself, fully awaken until after the Buddha's death alone, in a moment so private the texts describe him nearly missing it, catching it only as he was lying down to rest, his mind finally letting go of an effort he had been gripping too tightly for years. You should feel the weight of that for a second. Imagine spending decades beside the answer to every question that matters to you, watching it transform the man right next to you, and still having to walk your own particular, narrow road at your own pace, with no shortcut available simply because of who you stood near. If you have ever felt behind, watching someone close to you change in ways you haven't yet, despite identical circumstances, identical teachers, identical opportunities, you already understand something true about Ananda's decades of quiet, unglamorous waiting. Picture, specifically, what it must have felt like for Ananda to watch other monks reach realization around him during those same decades. Men who had ordained after him, sat beside him in the same teachings, and arrived, sometimes within a single retreat, at an understanding that continued to elude him despite his own much longer years of service and study. There is a particular, quiet loneliness in that kind of watching, distinct from any other kind of envy because it carries none of the usual resentment toward the person who succeeded. Ananda's own devotion would not have allowed that, only a private and persistent ache at being so close to something for so long without yet arriving there himself. This is where it gets remarkable, and it connects directly back to where this story began. The crowd in that village, gathered around fire, wanted a result they could feel immediately. Ananda, present for more of the actual teaching than almost anyone in human history, still needed years, then decades, and one final private moment of release that came only after he stopped straining for it. The narrow road did not move faster for him because of his closeness to its source. If anything, it asked more patience of him, not less. Sit with that contrast for a moment. The wide road promises speed and delivers nothing lasting. The narrow road promises nothing about speed at all, and delivers something that holds. And there's a passage worth bringing in here directly from one of the oldest texts describing this exact teaching at Deer Park in the Samyutta Nikaya known. It describes the Buddha's first sermon as the discovery of a middle way standing between two failed extremes, the indulgence that exhausts itself in pleasure and the self-punishment that exhausts itself in pain, and names the eightfold road between them as the one path that actually leads somewhere. Not the fastest path, not the most impressive path, the one that works. And here's the question hiding underneath everything in this chapter, and we'll keep circling back to it as this story widens. If the narrow road asks more patience, more discipline, or willingness to sit with discomfort rather than escape it, why would anyone choose it when the wide road is right there, loud and immediate and crowded with company? Some people, it turns out, choose it precisely because they have already tried the alternative and found it hollow. Others choose it because someone they trust walked it first and showed them it was possible without performing it as spectacle. And some, like Kondanna sitting under those trees, choose it the instant they finally see clearly for the first time exactly what they had been avoiding seeing. But choosing the narrow road once is not the same as staying on it. That is the part of this story we have not yet reached. The part where even people who saw clearly, who understood the teaching, who walked beside the teacher himself, will still feel the pull of something easier. Something more impressive, something that promises to be holier and harder and better than the narrow road itself. You will meet the man who builds that trap in a few chapters from now. And keep Kondanna's clarity and Ananda's patience in mind when you do, because what happens next in this story will test exactly the kind of person who has already proven once that they can recognize the truth. For now, walk back with me toward that village road, toward the woman with the dead child in her arms, and toward the charioteer who once drove a prince away from a palace without understanding yet what he was really driving him toward. By now you've watched Kondanna's eyes clear under those trees. You've sat for a moment inside Ananda's long, patient wait. But there is someone else from that same circle of early years whose story moves in almost the opposite direction. A man who understood almost nothing for a very long time, and yet ended up changing history simply by staying loyal anyway. His name was Channa, and before any of this began, he was a charioteer in a palace. The man whose job was driving a young prince wherever the prince wished to go. One night, that job became something else entirely. You should picture it the way Channa would have experienced it, not the way it gets summarized in religious art centuries later. A young father, restless and grieving something he could not yet name, wakes him in the dark and asks him to harness the horses without waking the household. No explanation, no plan beyond the gate. Channa does as he is told, because that is what loyalty looks like when you don't yet understand what you're being loyal to. He drives the prince out past the city walls, past the sleeping guards, into a darkness neither of them has a name for yet. And the prince asks him to stop, dismounts, removes his fine clothing, and asks Channa to take the horses, the chariot, and the news of what has happened back to the palace alone. You should picture the specific things Channa noticed in those last minutes, because the texts linger on them and they matter. The prince's wife was asleep in the next room when they left, her hand resting near their newborn son's small foot, and the prince had paused at the doorway long enough to look once before deciding not to wake her to say goodbye. Channa carried that image the entire ride, the doorway, the hand, the foot, the decision not to wake her, and it would return to him, uninvited, for years afterward, every time anyone asked him to explain what kind of man would leave a sleeping family in the dark without a word. Here's the part nobody tells you about that scene, the part every painting of it leaves out. Channa wept, not poetically, not symbolically. He stood on a dark road outside a city, holding the reins of an empty chariot, and he cried like a man who has just lost something he does not have words for yet, because he had. Consider the image itself for a moment, because it carries more weight than it first appears to. An empty chariot, reins held by a man who has nowhere left to drive it, is one of the oldest images of loyalty stripped of its usual function. Channa's entire purpose, for as long as he had served in the palace, had been to take the prince wherever he needed to go. That night, for the first time, the prince needed to go somewhere Channa could not follow, and the chariot itself, built for exactly the kind of service Channa had always provided, suddenly had nowhere left to carry anyone at all. He drove it back to the palace anyway, alone, empty vehicle returning from a journey it had only half completed, carrying nothing except the news of a departure no one back home was prepared to hear. He did not understand in that moment that he had just helped begin the most important spiritual search in human history. He understood only that the man he had served, the man he may have loved the way you love someone you've protected for years, was walking away from everything, and Channa could not follow. Hold this moment. We will return to Channa much later in this story, in a different chapter entirely, when understanding finally catches up to him slowly, not the way it does for most people, not all at once like it did for Kondanna. For now, notice something important about him. Channa was present for the single most consequential decision in this entire story, and he comprehended almost none of it. He simply did his job, carried his grief, and stayed faithful to a man whose path he could not yet see the shape of. If you have ever supported someone through a decision you privately didn't understand, a parent leaving a stable career, a friend ending a marriage, a sibling walking away from a life everyone else thought looked successful, you already know something about what Channa carried on that ride home alone. Loyalty without understanding is still loyalty. It is just a harder, lonelier kind. You should know what became of Channa in the years immediately following that night, because his loneliness did not end with the ride home. He returned to the palace to face a household in shock, a wife grieving a husband she did not yet know was alive, and a king, the prince's own father, desperate for any explanation Channa could offer, none of which satisfied a parent's grief. Channa was, in a sense, astonished simply for being the last person to see the prince leave, questioned repeatedly by a court that could not direct its anger anywhere else, now forced to relive the departure again and again for people who needed to understand what he himself did not yet understand. He carried this isolation for years, a strange position of being both witness and outsider to the most consequential decision in the kingdom's history, trusted with nothing except the unbearable knowledge of how it had happened. Now let's move the story forward several years, away from palaces and charioteers, toward a king who chose the narrow road for a very different reason, not out of grief and not out of instant clarity, but out of something closer to quiet, repeated curiosity that slowly hardened into conviction. His name was Bimbisara, and he ruled the kingdom of Magadha at the time the Buddha began teaching there. Kings, as a rule, not need new teachings. They have advisors. They have priests already telling them what they want to hear. They have built into the very structure of their lives enormous incentive to support whatever religious establishment already exists and reinforces their power. You should know how their first meeting actually happened, because it shows you something about Bimbisara's particular temperament. He encountered the Buddha not through any formal royal invitation, but almost by accident, having heard reports of a striking young ascetic teaching near his capital, and going out of simple curiosity rather than political calculation to see for himself. Other kings in his position might have sent an emissary first, testing the waters before risking their own reputation on an unproven teacher. Bimbisara went himself, sat among ordinary listeners without announcing his rank, listened to an entire teaching before anyone in the gathered crowd even realized the king of Magadha was sitting among them. This willingness to show up without ceremony, to risk looking foolish by being personally interested in something unproven, tells you something true about the kind of curiosity that eventually hardens into the conviction this story keeps returning to. Bimbisara had access to exactly that kind of comfortable arrangement. And here's the detail worth sitting with. He chose, instead, to spend time with a homeless teacher who told him uncomfortable truths about the nature of his own mind, who asked nothing from him in tribute, who offered him no spectacle and no flattery. This did not make Bimbisara popular with everyone at court. There is a particular kind of resistance that meets any powerful person who steps outside the expected role, quiet mockery from those who preferred the old, comfortable arrangement, suspicion from advisors who measured wisdom by how impressive a teacher looked rather than how true his words were. Bimbisara absorbed that resistance and kept returning anyway, again and again, not for ordinary conversations rather than miraculous displays. You can imagine what those court conversations sounded like. the ones that happened after Bimbisara left to visit his unimpressive teacher again. Senior ministers, the kind who had built careers on managing the king's relationship with established temples, exchanging glances over the king's empty seat. A particular court priest, whose family had advised kings of Magadha for 3 generations, finding new and increasingly elaborate ways to suggest, without ever saying it outright, that a king's time was too valuable to spend sitting in dust with a homeless man who offered no blessings, no rituals, nothing that could be pointed to as evidence of divine favor on the kingdom. Bimbisara heard all of it. He kept going anyway. This is the Pali word worth holding on to here. Sila. Moral conduct, not the dramatic, visible kind of virtue that draws applause, but the unglamorous discipline practiced quietly, day after day, mostly unwitnessed by anyone who might be impressed by it. Bimbisara's support for the Sangha was built on exactly this kind of unglamorous foundation. Not spectacle, but steady, repeated, often invisible commitment. Think about how rarely this kind of virtue gets celebrated in any era, including your own. The wide road has always rewarded visible generosity over quiet consistency, the large public donation over years of unnoticed small kindnesses, the dramatic gesture of forgiveness over the much harder, much less visible discipline of simply not nursing a grudge in the first place. Sila asks for the second kind in every case, a kind that produces no applause precisely because nobody outside your own mind ever has full visibility into whether you actually practiced it. This is, in its own way, one of the narrow road's quietest tests. Are you willing to build something real, specifically in the places no one will ever see it, simply because building it there happens to be true? Here's where it gets remarkable, and it connects something we touched on back at that fire trick scene on the village road. The crowd gathered around the counterfeit teacher because his miracles were visible and immediate. Bimbisara, a king with every resource available to demand visible miracles for himself, chose instead a teacher who offered him nothing to display, nothing to brag about at court, nothing flashy enough to silence his critics. None. He chose the narrow road specifically because it was narrow, because its very lack of spectacle was to him a kind of evidence that something honest was happening inside it. Stay with this contrast for a moment, because it is the engine driving the rest of this story forward. Spectacle and truth are not opposites by accident. They are frequently opposites by nature. The things most capable of gathering an immediate crowd are, very often, things least capable of delivering what they promise. Because manufacturing the appearance of something real takes far less effort than building the real thing. But notice something else, something easy to miss in Bimbisara's story. Choosing the narrow road did not mean Bimbisara withdrew from the world, became a hermit, or stopped being a king. He kept ruling. He kept managing armies, treasuries, court politics, all of it. The narrow road in his case was not an escape from ordinary life. It was a different way of standing inside that same ordinary life, steadier, quieter, less reactive to the noise around him. You can picture what this steadiness actually looked like in practice. In the small, ordinary moments a chronicle rarely bothers to record. Court disputes that might once have provoked a sharp, defensive response from him now received a longer pause before any reply. Criticism that would once have required an immediate face-saving rebuttal could now simply be heard, considered, and set aside without the same urgency to win the exchange. None of this made him a different king in any dramatic, visible sense. It made him the same king doing the same work, but increasingly less driven by the old reactive patterns that had once made every challenge to his authority feel like an emergency requiring an immediate response. This matters because it corrects something the wide road loves to imply, that the alternative to spectacle must itself be dramatic in the opposite direction. Total renunciation, total withdrawal, a complete abandonment of normal responsibility. It rarely works that way. Most people who walk the narrow road keep their ordinary lives almost entirely intact. No, what changes is something quieter and harder to see from the outside. How they relate to the noise, the fear, the craving that used to run their decisions without their notice. And there's one more thing worth saying before we close this chapter and step back to look at the wider pattern building underneath these three stories. Channa's grief, Kondanna's instant clarity, Bimbisara's slow, repeated choice. None of these three men arrived at the narrow road the same way. One arrived through loyalty he didn't yet understand. One arrived through a single moment of total clarity. One arrived through years of quiet, repeated curiosity that hardened slowly into conviction. The road did not demand a single kind of person, a single kind of temperament, a single kind of starting point. What it demanded in every case was the same thing, a willingness to keep walking even when walking offered no applause, no spectacle, and no guarantee of an immediate result. If you've made it this far into this story, something in you is already doing exactly that. Has there ever been a moment in your own life where you chose the quieter, harder option? Not because anyone applauded you for it, but because something in you simply knew it was right. I'd love to hear that story in the comments below. Before we go further, if a story like this one is landing for you, if you're starting to notice this pattern in your own life already, the subscribe button genuinely helps more people find their way to teachings like this one. It costs you nothing, and it means a great deal. Now, let's go back to that village one more time, and to the woman who is still standing in the crowd with her dead child in her arms, because her story is about to take a turn nobody in that village expects, and it begins with something far stranger than a cure. And by now you've sat with three very different men, a grieving charioteer, an instantly awakened ascetic, a king who chose curiosity over comfort. Before we step further into this story, it's worth pausing on something modern science has only recently been able to measure, because it explains exactly why that crowd around the fire-trick teacher was so large, and why men like Bimbisara were so rare. In the 1950s, a psychologist named Solomon Asch ran a now famous series of experiments. He placed a single person in a room with several others, actors secretly working for him, and asked the group a simple question: which of three lines matched a reference line in length? The answer was obvious. Anyone looking clearly could see it instantly. But the actors, one by one, gave the wrong answer out loud with total confidence. Picture the room itself for a moment, because the specific shape of the pressure matters. The real participant sits near the end of a line of chairs, close enough to hear every answer given before their own turn arrives. And the first actor answers confidently wrongly. The second does the same. By the third or fourth wrong answer, something visible happens in most participants, a slight hesitation, eyes moving back to the lines as if checking again. A shift in posture, sometimes audible discomfort, a nervous laugh before giving an answer that contradicts their own eyes. Asch later interviewed many participants afterward, and what they reported was rarely simple confusion. Many of them said they assumed in the moment that something must be wrong with their own perception rather than with the room full of people disagreeing with it. The mind, faced with a contradiction between private sight and public consensus, very often distrusts the private sight first. And here's what should unsettle you. Roughly a third of real participants, not hearing confident wrong answers from people around them, eventually gave the wrong answer too, not because their eyes had changed, but because something in the human nervous system treats group agreement as a kind of evidence almost as powerful as direct perception itself. Later studies using brain imaging found something even stranger. When people conformed to a group's wrong answer, the brain regions associated with actual visual perception sometimes shifted activity to match the group's claim. It wasn't always simple peer pressure overriding a clear-eyed judgment. Sometimes the group's confidence appeared to bend what people thought they were seeing in the first place. This finding deserves to be taken seriously rather than treated as a curious footnote, because it changes the nature of the problem this entire video is describing. If conformity were only a matter of people privately knowing the truth and choosing, out of social fear, to say something else, no, the solution might simply be courage, enough willpower to speak your private knowledge regardless of consequence. But if group consensus can actually reshape what the brain registers as perception itself, then the danger runs deeper than mere cowardice. It suggests that standing in a large enough crowd of confident wrongness can alter not just what you are willing to say, but what you are capable of seeing clearly in the first place. This is precisely why the narrow road has always required more than individual willpower alone. It requires distance, physical, social, or simply attentional, from the kind of overwhelming consensus that can quietly recalibrate a perception before conscious choice even has a chance to intervene. You don't need a psychology degree to feel why this matters. And you have felt this pull yourself. In a meeting where you privately disagreed but stayed quiet. In a family gathering where you nodded along with something you didn't believe. In a crowd, online or in person, where dissent felt heavier than agreement. This is not a character flaw unique to weak people. It is closer to a default setting built into the nervous system long before any of us had a say in the matter. Useful for surviving in small tribal groups thousands of years ago, often costly now. And when the group in question might be confidently wrong about something that actually matters. 25 centuries before Ash ever built his experiment, the Buddha was already describing the same mechanism without a laboratory. Anguttara Nikaya, he taught that people are drawn toward what is easy to see, easy to do, and easy to receive praise for, while the harder, truer road goes largely unnoticed, precisely because it offers nothing dramatic for a crowd to rally around. Here's the part nobody tells you. And it connects everything in this story so far back to that village road. The crowd around the fire trick teacher was not behaving irrationally by ancient or modern standards. They were behaving exactly the way human nervous systems are built to behave around confident, visible group consensus. Standing apart from a crowd that confident takes something the nervous system actively resists. Which is precisely why Bimbisara's quiet choice to walk a different road mattered as much as it did. And it is worth returning briefly to what made Bimbisara's resistance to that pull so unusual, because the Ash research helps explain exactly why his choice should be considered remarkable rather than merely admirable in an abstract sense. He was, after all, surrounded by his own version of confident, visible consensus. An entire court culture built around assumptions he was quietly stepping outside of. The same nervous system pull that made ordinary participants in Ash's experiment doubt their own clear vision was, presumably, pulling at Bimbisara too every single time he chose to return to an unimpressive teacher instead of the comfortable consensus surrounding him. His steadiness was not the absence of that pull. It was the repeated, unglamorous choice to act against it anyway. Now let's meet someone whose entire life became a study in exactly this kind of resistance, in a much more material, much more public way than Bimbisara ever attempted. A merchant named Anathapindika. Anathapindika was, by every measure his society used, an enormously successful man, wealthy, respected, and connected to powerful families through business and marriage. He had everything the wide road typically promises as its reward, and he had earned it the ordinary way, through decades of careful, unglamorous work. He first heard the Buddha teach. Something in him recognized the same quality Bimbisara had recognized, not spectacle, but honesty. And he decided almost immediately to do something his entire social circle considered close to insane. He began buying land at an enormous price, far beyond what it was worth, specifically to build a monastery for this teacher and his followers. You should sit with how strange this looked from the outside. Here was a man who had spent his whole life accumulating wealth through careful calculation, suddenly spending an outrageous sum on land for a wandering teacher with no temple, no priesthood, no official religious standing in the existing social order. His peers did not understand it. Some openly mocked him for it. Wasting a fortune, they said, on a man who promised nothing but difficult, invisible inner work. It is worth imagining how that mockery actually reached him, because wealthy, well-connected men in his position rarely escape ridicule delivered indirectly rather than to their face. He would have heard it secondhand through business partners repeating jokes made at dinners he hadn't attended, on through the careful, almost too polite questions of associates clearly fishing for an explanation that would let them dismiss the purchase as a passing eccentricity rather than a genuine reordering of his priorities. He answered these questions, by most accounts, with the same calm directness he brought to every business matter. Not defensively, not apologetically, simply stating that he had found something worth this price, and declining to spend further energy convincing anyone else of a judgment he had already made with full clarity. The negotiation itself became a small legend on its own. The owner of the grove, a prince named Jada, never actually expected to sell. He set a price meant to be refused, telling Anathapindika the land was his only if he covered every inch of it with gold coins laid edge to edge. He said this the way people say something to end a conversation, not begin one. Anathapindika went home, gathered carts of gold from his own treasury, and returned the next day, his servants beginning the slow, absurd work of laying coin after coin across the grove's earth. Word spread through the city faster than the carts could be unloaded. By the time the last corner of ground remained uncovered, Prince Jada himself came to watch, and something in the sheer, methodical seriousness of the act, a wealthy man literally paving ground with his own fortune rather than walk away from a difficult teaching, moved him enough that he donated the final uncovered strip of land himself, asking only that his own name be remembered alongside the gift. There's one more thing worth saying here. Anathapindika did not stop being a careful, practical businessman the moment he made this choice, and he negotiated the land price the same way he negotiated everything else in his life, precisely, without sentiment, refusing to be cheated even in service of something he believed in deeply. The narrow road, once again, not erase who he already was. It simply redirected the same discipline he'd always had towards something he now believed mattered more. This is the Pali word worth holding here, saddha, often translated as faith, but worth understanding more precisely as confidence. Not blind belief, not the kind of faith that asks you to ignore evidence, but a grounded trust built through testing, observation, and direct experience. Anathapindika's confidence in this teaching was not naive. It was the same kind of confidence he brought to every successful business decision in his life, applied now to something the rest of his social world considered worthless. The monastery he built became known as Jetavana, and it would go on to host some of the most important teachings recorded in the entire Pali canon. None of that existed yet. In the moment, his peers were mocking him for wasting his fortune. He could not have known, standing there negotiating an absurd land price, that he was building something that would outlast every fortune his critics ever accumulated. It is worth pausing on just how thoroughly history eventually vindicated this specific ridiculed decision. And centuries after Anathapindika's death, when the wealth of his mocking peers had long since dissolved into forgotten family lines and disputed inheritances, Jetavana remained a site of pilgrimage, its name preserved in texts still studied today, in languages and countries Anathapindika could never have imagined existing. The land he was mocked for overpaying for became, in the most literal sense, one of the most consequential pieces of ground in the religious history of the entire region. None of his critics' fortunes left a comparable trace, and this is not offered as proof that generosity always pays off in some measurable worldly sense. Bimbisara's eventual fate, which this story will return to, refuses any such simple promise. It is offered only as a reminder that the size of the mockery a decision attracts in its own moment has never been reliable evidence of how that decision will look generations later. There's another figure worth bringing into this chapter, because his relationship to this teaching looked nothing like Anathapindika's confident generosity, and nothing like Bimbisara's quiet curiosity either. And his name was Pasenadi, king of neighboring Kosala, and what defined him was not certainty but persistence. Pasenadi visited the Buddha repeatedly over many years, and almost every visit recorded in the text shows the same pattern. He arrives not with praise, not seeking a miracle, but with a hard, specific, often uncomfortable question. And why do good people sometimes suffer terribly while cruel people sometimes prosper? What is the actual difference between someone who merely looks wise and someone who genuinely is? Can a king ever truly trust the people who flatter him? One visit, recorded in some detail, has Pasenadi arriving visibly troubled after a meal, during which several courtiers had praised his wisdom so extravagantly that even he, accustomed to flattery, found it difficult to sit through. And he asked the Buddha directly how a king could tell the difference between a minister who truly served him and one who had simply learned to perform loyalty convincingly enough to be indistinguishable from the real thing. The answer he received was not comforting. He was told that this distinction often only reveals itself under pressure, in moments of genuine crisis, scarcity, or risk, and that a king who waits for crisis to test his minister's loyalty has often waited too long to act on what crisis reveals. Fasna sat with that answer for a long time before speaking again. And here's the question hiding underneath Pasenadi's visits, and it's worth asking yourself directly. How many people do you know who keep returning to hard questions instead of comfortable answers? Most people, when they find a teacher or a belief that feels good, stop asking the questions that might complicate that comfort. Pasenadi did the opposite, again and again, for years, never quite settling into easy certainty about anything. This is, in its own way, exactly the temperament the narrow road requires and the wide road actively discourages. The wide road offers resolution quickly, a story that explains everything, a confident teacher with a satisfying answer, a sense of having arrived. The narrow road in someone like Pasenadi's hands looks more like an ongoing practice of staying uncomfortable with not knowing, on purpose, because premature certainty is its own kind of trap. It is worth noting that Pasenadi's restlessness never curdled into cynicism, which is its own quiet achievement worth naming. Plenty of people, faced repeatedly with answers more complicated than they hoped for, eventually stop asking altogether, deciding that if nothing offers easy certainty, certainty itself must not be worth pursuing. Pasenadi kept returning instead, decade after decade, choosing to remain a serious question asker rather than either a comfortable believer or a disillusioned skeptic. This middle position, neither naive belief nor dismissive cynicism, but patient and ongoing inquiry, turns out to be one of the narrow road's quietest and least celebrated requirements, easy to overlook next to more dramatic stories of sudden conversion or total collapse, but every bit as essential to walking the road honestly over an entire lifetime. Let that sit for a moment. And because the next few chapters of this story are about exactly that trap. What happens when someone builds a teaching that looks even more rigorous, even more impressive, even more demanding than the genuine narrow road, while actually leading somewhere else entirely? You have now met 4 people who chose difficulty over ease for very different reasons. Channa's confused loyalty, Kondanna's sudden clarity, Bimbisara's quiet curiosity, Anathapindika's calculated confidence, and Pasenadi's restless, unresolved questioning. Keep all 5 of them in mind. And because what comes next in this story is going to test something none of them were ever tested on directly. What happens when the trap itself starts looking exactly like the narrow road they each, in their own way, learned to recognize? 5 very different temperaments, 5 very different paths into the same difficult road. None of them required a particular kind of personality to walk it. They required only a willingness, sustained over time, to keep choosing the harder direction even when nothing immediate rewarded that choice. You have now met 5 people who each, in their own way, chose the harder road over the easier one. Now you are about to meet someone who understood the appeal of the harder road so well that he learned to weaponize it. Someone who built a path that looked stricter, holier, and more demanding than the Buddha's own teaching, and convinced hundreds of people to follow him onto it. His name was Devadatta, and he was the Buddha's own cousin. You should understand something about him before this story turns dark, because it matters for everything that follows. Devadatta was not a fool, and he was not lazy, and he was not even, at first, acting in obvious bad faith. He had ordained as a monk. He had trained seriously. By every visible measure available to the people around him, he looked like a dedicated, capable practitioner. Disciplined, articulate, intelligent enough to hold his own in difficult debates about the teaching. There is a detail from his earlier years worth knowing because it shows you the seed this later ambition grew from. Devadatta had, by several accounts, developed genuine meditative attainments, abilities the texts describe in terms of concentration and psychic power, the kind of attainments that, in that era, drew real respect from other monks. He was not pretending to have nothing, he had something, and it is precisely this. Having something real, something earned, something that genuinely set him apart from ordinary practitioners, that made the temptation toward adhimana so much more dangerous for him than it would have been for someone with nothing to be proud of in the first place. Counterfeit conviction rarely grows in soil that has nothing real in it. It grows fastest in soil that has just enough real attainment to make the additional false certainty feel earned. This is exactly what makes his story so unsettling, and exactly why it belongs at the center of this video. The wide road is easy to recognize when it looks like fire tricks and miracle performances on a dusty village road. It is far harder to recognize when it looks like extra discipline, when it looks like more rigor, not less, when it looks like the very thing this whole story has been telling you to admire. Here's where the trap begins. And at some point in his training, Devadatta approached the Buddha with a proposal. 5 additional rules, stricter than anything currently required of the monastic community. Monks should live permanently in the forest, never in buildings. They should survive entirely on alms gathered by begging, never accepting food offered directly in a home. They should wear only robes made from discarded rags, never anything given as a gift. They should sleep only at the base of trees, never under any other shelter. And they should never eat fish or meat under any circumstance, regardless of how it was obtained. Read those 5 rules again slowly. Notice something important. None of them are evil. None of them are obviously corrupt or self-serving on the surface. They sound, if anything, like exactly the kind of intensified austerity a sincere seeker might propose in pursuit of deeper purity. You should picture the specific moment Devadatta presented these rules to the Buddha, because the staging of it matters. And he did not propose them privately, in a quiet conversation where disagreement could be worked through gradually. He raised them publicly, in front of the assembled community, phrasing each rule as a question designed to make refusal look like exactly the kind of laxity he intended to suggest. Would it not be better, he asked, if monks lived permanently in the forest? And would it not be better if they ate only what they begged, never what was offered in a home? Each question was built so that any answer other than enthusiastic agreement risked sounding, to anyone listening without context, like an argument in favor of comfort over discipline. This is itself a recognizable pattern, one that recurs throughout history whenever someone wants to corner an audience into agreement, frame the harder-sounding option as the only honest option, and frame any nuance or caution as cowardice in disguise. This is not a story about strictness for its own sake. This is not a story about discipline being dangerous. This is not even, fundamentally, a story about Devadatta's ambition alone, though ambition was certainly present. This is a story about how counterfeit virtue is built deliberately, a look more sacred than the real thing, and how the most dangerous version of the wide road is never the one that looks indulgent. It's the one that looks holier than the actual narrow path. The Buddha refused the proposal, not because the practices themselves were forbidden. A monk who wished to live this way voluntarily was free to do so, but he refused to make these 5 rules mandatory for the entire community because mandatory extremes, not imposed from outside rather than chosen from genuine insight, become their own kind of rigid attachment. A rule followed out of fear of judgment is not the same thing as a discipline emerging from clarity. From the outside, the two can look identical. From the inside, they are nothing alike. This distinction deserves more weight than a single sentence usually gives it, because it is the exact mechanism by which sincere communities curdle into rigid, fear-based ones across history far beyond this single story. A practice chosen freely from clarity can be released the moment it stops serving its purpose, adjusted, questioned, refined. A practice imposed as mandatory proof of commitment cannot be questioned without the questioner being suspected of insufficient devotion, which means the practice itself becomes, over time, less important than the appearance of unwavering adherence to it. This is precisely the trap Devadatta's 5 rules were built to spring. Once accepted as mandatory, they would have stopped being a path toward clarity and started being a permanent test of loyalty, exactly the kind of test that rewards visible conformity over genuine understanding. Devadatta did not accept this answer quietly. None. The reasoning the Buddha had offered him was more precise than a simple refusal. He pointed out that the middle way he had already taught was not a compromise chosen out of weakness or comfort, but a deliberate rejection of both extremes after testing each one personally to exhaustion. He had already lived the kind of austerity Devadatta was now proposing as an improvement, had nearly died practicing it, and had found, at the end of all that suffering, nothing except more suffering. To mandate that same extreme for an entire community on the strength of how impressive it looked rather than what it had actually been shown to produce was to repeat a mistake he had personally already paid the cost of correcting. He offered this explanation calmly, without anger, in front of the same monks who would, within days, hear a very different version of this refusal from Devadatta himself. You can picture the specific texture of Devadatta's reaction to that refusal, because the accounts preserve it with unusual care. And he did not argue his case again, calmly, in front of the same assembly that had just heard it. He left that meeting and began having quiet, separate conversations instead, with younger monks especially, the ones newest to discipline and most susceptible to the suggestion that the most senior teacher among them had grown soft. He framed every conversation slightly differently depending on who he was speaking to. To the ambitious, he offered status as an early follower of something more rigorous. To the doubtful, he offered the simple reassurance that strictness could never actually be a bad thing, regardless of who endorsed it. To the uncertain, and he offered the comfort of an answer more definite than anything the Buddha's own teaching, with its careful nuance, seemed willing to provide. Here's the part that still unsettles modern readers of this story, the part that explains exactly why hundreds of people were about to make a terrible decision without realizing it. Devadatta took his rejected proposal and presented it to the wider community of monks as evidence that the Buddha himself had grown lax, comfortable, insufficiently rigorous in his old age. And he positioned his 5 rules as the truer, harder, more demanding path. The path for serious practitioners who weren't satisfied with anything less than total austerity. None. And 500 monks, 500 men who had already chosen, once, to leave behind ordinary life for the narrow road, looked at Devadatta's proposal and followed him away from the community. Sit with that number for a moment, because it should trouble you more than the village crowd around the fire trick teacher ever did. That crowd, at least, was made up of people who had never walked any serious spiritual road at all. These 500 men had already walked it. They had already ordained, already trained, already proven once that they could recognize and choose difficulty over comfort. And it was not comfort that pulled them away from the actual narrow road. It was something that looked even more difficult, even more demanding, even more impressively committed than the path they were already on. You should understand the specific reasoning many of them likely used to justify the decision, because reasoning, even flawed reasoning, is rarely absent from a choice this consequential. Some among them had genuinely struggled with the comparative comfort of monastic life under the Buddha's existing rules, meals offered directly by households, occasional shelter in buildings during harsh weather, robes sometimes given as gifts rather than gathered from discarded cloth. To minds already primed to associate comfort with compromise, Devadatta's proposal did not look like a manipulation. It looked like exactly the correction their own private doubts had been quietly suggesting was needed. This is perhaps the most unsettling detail in this entire chapter. Many of these 500 men were not following Devadatta blindly. They believed, with what felt to them like genuine conviction, that they were finally choosing the harder, truer path their own consciences had been pointing toward. It is worth asking what this means for anyone listening today who has ever felt that same private suspicion that an established practice has grown too comfortable, too forgiving of compromise, in need of someone bold enough to demand more. That suspicion, this story is careful to show you, is not always wrong. Devadatta himself had identified, somewhat accurately, certain genuine comforts available within ordinary monastic life. The danger was never in noticing the comfort. The danger was in assuming that more visible difficulty automatically constituted a more truthful correction, rather than asking, as the Buddha himself had asked when he refused the proposal, whether the correction actually served liberation or merely served the appearance of seriousness. This is the Pali word that names exactly what was operating in Devadatta himself, and it's worth sitting with carefully. Adamana, conceit. Specifically the conceit of overestimating one's own spiritual attainment, not simple arrogance in the ordinary sense, but a particular distortion where genuine effort and genuine insight curdle into something that needs to be seen as superior, needs external proof of its own advancement, needs followers as confirmation that the path being walked is not just valid but exceptional. Here's what 500 monks discovered too late, and we'll watch exactly how they discovered it in the next chapter. A path built on adimana cannot actually deliver what it promises, no matter how rigorous its outward rules appear, because the underlying motivation distorts everything built on top of it. Discipline practiced in service of ego is not the same discipline as discipline practiced in service of genuine liberation, even when the two look from a distance identical in their daily routine. The Vinaya texts that record this episode, the Kulavagga, part of the monastic code's historical accounts, describe Devadatta's schism with unusual directness for documents of their era. They do not soften what happened. They name it plainly as a fracture in the community, caused by a teaching designed to look more sacred than the truth it was actually displacing. There's a detail in this story worth pausing on, because it connects something we touched on earlier in this video, back when we first met King Bimbisara. Devadatta did not act entirely alone in his ambitions. He found an ally in Bimbisara's own son, a young prince named Ajatasattu, and what passed between them in private, away from any public schism over monastic rules, was about to cost far more than 500 monks walking away from a teacher. We are not ready for that part of the story yet. Keep Ajatasattu's name in mind. We will return to him and to the quiet doubt already forming behind his eyes very soon. For now, notice what this chapter has actually shown you underneath the specific details of robes and alms bowls and forest dwellings. The most convincing counterfeit of the narrow road is never the one dressed up as comfort, and it's the one dressed up as superior discipline, because by the time you're impressed enough by someone's apparent rigor to follow them, you have usually stopped asking the one question that would have protected you. Not, is this difficult enough to be real, but is this actually leading anywhere true? And before we follow those 500 monks further into the consequences of that choice, if this story is starting to make you look differently at certainty you've encountered in your own life, dressed up as extra devotion or extra rigor, the subscribe button helps more people find their way to a story like this one. Now let's go with those 500 men, away from the community they once called home, and watch exactly what they find on the road Devadatta promised them. By now you've watched Devadatta build his trap carefully, dressing rejection up as superior rigor, convincing 500 monks that the Buddha himself had grown too comfortable. What happened next did not stay contained inside the monastic community. It reached all the way into a palace and into the private mind of a young prince who had every reason to trust his own father and chose instead to trust someone else. His name was Ajatasattu, and he was King Bimbisara's son. And you remember Bimbisara from earlier in this story. The king who chose quiet, repeated conversation with an unimpressive teacher over the comfortable religious establishment already available to him. What you don't yet know is what that choice looked like from the perspective of his own son, growing up in a court where some advisors still quietly mocked the king's devotion behind closed doors. It is worth pausing on what it might have actually felt like to be that particular child in that particular court before assigning him any simple villainy. A son watching a father be quietly mocked for something the son does not yet have the maturity or distance to evaluate fairly will often experience that mockery as a kind of second-hand shame, internalized long before he develops the judgment to question whether the mockery was deserved in the first place. This does not excuse what Ajatasattu eventually did. It simply explains the particular soil Devadatta found already prepared when he arrived, offering something that promised to replace inherited shame with earned exceptionalism instead. Ajatasattu did not grow up admiring his father's narrow road. He grew up watching it from a distance, hearing the same court whispers everyone else heard, not absorbing a particular kind of doubt that children of devoted people sometimes absorb. A suspicion that their parents' quiet conviction might actually be a kind of weakness, a softness unsuited to a king who would someday need to rule with strength rather than humility. You should understand what specific moments built that suspicion in him, because doubt like this rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates from small, repeated scenes, watching his father sit for hours in plain robes, indistinguishable from any ordinary visitor, while foreign delegations waited outside expecting royal ceremony. Hearing generals mutter, just loud enough to be overheard, that a kingdom led by a man so easily satisfied with so little might not survive its first real test of strength. Noticing, as boys notice these things more sharply than adults realize, that his father seemed to care less about being impressive to his own son than about being honest with him, answering Ajatasattu's questions about power and rule with the same plain, sometimes disappointing honesty he brought to everything else. When what a young prince often wants instead is a parent who makes ambition feel justified rather than complicated. Devadatta understood exactly how to use this. He did not approach Ajatasattu as a religious teacher seeking a patron. He approached him as someone offering proximity to power, a teaching that, in Devadatta's framing, was stricter, more serious, more suited to a future king than his father's quieter devotion. He offered Ajatasattu something Bimbisara's narrow road never offered anyone, the feeling of being chosen for something exceptional. And you should know how this first approach actually happened. because the texts preserve a level of calculated patience that makes Devadatta's manipulation feel even more deliberate than a single dramatic conversation would suggest. He did not begin with grand promises. He began instead by simply spending time with the young prince, joining him for ordinary activities, listening more than speaking, allowing Ajatasattu to talk at length about frustrations with the court, with advisors who treated him as merely a future king rather than a present one, with a father whose patience sometimes felt to an ambitious young man indistinguishable from indifference. Only once this foundation of apparent friendship and careful listening had been built did Devadatta begin gradually, suggesting that a king who wished to rule with real strength might need a teacher who understood strength better than a teacher who had built his entire reputation on gentleness. Here's the part nobody tells you about how this kind of corruption actually spreads. It rarely begins with an obviously evil proposal. It begins with flattery disguised as recognition, the suggestion that you specifically are suited for something greater than what your elders have settled for. Ajatasattu did not wake up one morning deciding to betray his father. He was led there one small concession at a time, each one easier than the last, because the one before it had already been crossed. Notice what just happened in this story, because it mirrors something we already watched happen to 500 monks. A person who might have resisted an obvious temptation toward indulgence proved far more vulnerable to a temptation dressed up as ambition, as destiny, as being recognized for something special. And the wide road rarely announces itself honestly. It arrives wearing whatever costume the listener is least prepared to question. And you should understand the private justification Ajatasattu likely built for himself during this period, because almost no one, even someone heading toward an act as dark as patricide, experiences their own choices as simple villainy while making them. He had by this point convinced himself that his father's gentleness constituted a genuine danger to the kingdom, that a ruler this unconcerned with displaying strength would eventually be exploited by ambitious neighbors or undermined by his own court, and that someone needed to act decisively before that vulnerability became catastrophic. This is, in its own bleak way, a recognizable shape of self-deception, framing a self-serving act as a painful necessity, a reluctant sacrifice made for the good of something larger than personal ambition. Devadatta did not need to convince Ajatasattu that betraying his father was good. He only needed to help him believe it was, somehow, unavoidable. Now, let's follow those 500 monks who left with Devadatta, because their story is about to answer the question this entire chapter has been circling. What actually happens when you follow a path built on adhimana, on conceit dressed as superior discipline instead of the genuine narrow road? At first, very little seemed wrong. The 500 monks kept their stricter rules. They lived in forests. They begged for every meal. They wore only discarded cloth. By every external measure, they were doing exactly what they had been promised, walking a harder, more demanding road than the one they had left behind. You should picture what their days actually looked like during this period, because the texture of ordinary routine matters more than the drama of the schism itself. Mornings spent walking long distances between villages because forest dwellings, by Devadatta's new rule, could never be close enough to a town to make begging convenient. Evenings spent comparing, quietly, whose robes were more thoroughly patched from discarded cloth, whose alms bowl showed more wear, whose endurance of hunger had gone furthest without complaint. A competition none of them would have named outright, but one that grew, almost without anyone noticing, out of a community that had built its entire identity around visible austerity. Some among them began keeping a kind of private tally, watching their fellow monks for any sign of softness, ready to notice it the way a counterfeit movement always needs its members to notice each other's apparent failures. And because mutual surveillance is often how a counterfeit sustains the appearance of rigor once the founder's personal magnetism alone is no longer enough. But something was missing, and it took most of them time to feel it clearly enough to name it. Here's the detail the chronicles almost buried. The kind of detail that gets lost when a story focuses only on rules and rituals instead of the quality of mind underneath them. The 500 monks had traded one set of external behaviors for another, stricter set of external behaviors. What they had not done, what Devadatta's teaching never actually addressed, was the deeper internal work the rules were originally meant to support. Living in a forest does not, by itself, dissolve craving. Begging for every meal does not by itself dissolve aversion. Wearing discarded cloth does not by itself dissolve delusion. This is the Pali word worth sitting with here, moha, delusion, specifically the kind of fog that makes a wrong road look not just acceptable but superior. The 500 monks were not stupid for following Devadatta. They were caught in exactly the kind of fog the earliest texts describe with such precision, a fog that makes the more rigorous-looking option appear automatically more truthful, simply because it demands more visible sacrifice. You should picture how that fog actually felt from inside one of those monks' own minds, because delusion of this kind rarely announces itself as delusion while it is happening. It would have felt, instead, like clarity, like finally seeing through a comfortable compromise that lesser practitioners had settled for, like belonging to the small, serious minority willing to do what the larger, softer majority would not. This is precisely what makes moha so dangerous to recognize from inside it. It does not feel like confusion. It feels like the sharpest, most confident certainty a person has ever experienced, which is exactly why patient exposure to plain truth, rather than louder argument, was the only thing capable of dissolving it. You should feel the weight of what this means because it applies far beyond ancient monasteries. The hardest version of the wide road to recognize is never the one offering you comfort, and it's the one offering you the feeling of superior commitment, the sense that because you are sacrificing more, working harder, following stricter rules than people around you, you must therefore be more correct than they are. Difficulty by itself has never been proof of truth. It only feels that way, especially to a mind already primed by Adhimana to need that proof. Word of the schism reached the wider Buddhist community and reached, eventually, the Buddha himself. He did not respond with anger, and he did not send anyone to forcibly reclaim the monks who had left. It is worth knowing how the monks who remained, the ones who had not followed Devadatta at all, and reacted in the meantime, because their restraint mirrors something this entire story keeps circling back to. Several accounts describe younger monks, freshly ordained, asking with visible frustration why nothing was being done immediately to denounce Devadatta publicly, to warn newer practitioners loudly enough that no one else might be tempted to follow him. The more senior monks among them, the texts suggest, counseled patience instead, not from indifference to what had happened, but from a settled trust that truth, given enough room and enough time, rarely needs to be defended through volume. This patience asks something difficult of everyone who stayed behind. The willingness to watch 500 fellow practitioners walk toward what looked, in the moment, like a genuine threat to everything they had built together, without responding to that fear by abandoning the very steadiness the schism was testing. You should understand how news like this actually traveled in a world without any of the speed modern movements depend on. It moved through travelers passing between monasteries, through merchants who happened to overhear monks debating the schism at a market stall, through the ordinary churn of religious communities exchanging news whenever paths crossed on dusty roads between cities. By the time the full account reached the Buddha, weeks had likely passed since the 500 monks first followed Devadatta into the forest, Weeks during which rumor and exaggeration could easily have hardened into something far more dramatic than what had actually occurred. And it is worth noticing that the Buddha's calm response was not the response of someone reacting to fresh, sharp news. It was the considered response of someone who had time to think clearly about what mattered most in this crisis and chose, even with that time, not to escalate. What he did instead becomes the subject of the next part of this story. But it's worth noting here, before we get there, what he didn't do, because it tells you something important about how the narrow road handles betrayal. He did not denounce Devadatta publicly in front of the wider community to win back loyalty through condemnation, not pressure the 500 monks with threats or shame to return. The narrow road, even faced with its most serious internal threat, did not respond by becoming louder, more dramatic, or more aggressively persuasive than the counterfeit that had just stolen 500 of its practitioners. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it runs directly against instinct. And when something true is being outcompeted by something false and louder, the natural impulse is to become louder yourself, to match drama with drama, spectacle with spectacle, in order to win back the attention you've lost. And the Buddha's response to this entire crisis suggests something different, that matching the wide road's volume would have meant abandoning exactly the quality that made the narrow road trustworthy in the first place. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Ajatasattu's private doubt about his father had hardened into something far more dangerous than doubt. He had begun quietly not to imagine a future in which he did not wait for his father's natural death to take the throne. A thought Devadatta, by all later accounts, did nothing to discourage and a great deal to encourage. We are not yet at the moment when that thought becomes action. Keep it carried with you the way you've carried the man with the cracked bowl, the way you've carried Kisa Gotami's grief. Some doors, once opened even slightly, become almost impossible to close again, and Ajatasattu has just opened one. The later Sri Lankan chronicle known as the Mahavamsa, written centuries after these events, records something worth bringing in here. It describes later splits within the Buddhist community where teachings claiming canonical authority diverge sharply from what the earliest text actually preserved. A pattern, the chronicle suggests, that did not begin or end with Devadatta, but recurred across generations, each time wearing a slightly different disguise. It is worth knowing briefly what some of these later splits actually looked like, because they confirm something this story has already shown you in miniature. The chronicle describes councils convened specifically to settle disputes over which teachings genuinely traced back to the earliest tradition, and which had drifted gradually into reinterpretation serving the interests of whoever proposed them. In nearly every case the chronicle records, the disputed teachings that eventually proved unreliable had one feature in common. They offered something more certainty, more spiritual status, more dramatic claims about attainment than the more cautious, harder to verify original teaching had ever claimed for itself. The wide road, and even within a tradition explicitly built to resist it, kept finding new openings century after century simply because the appeal of more never stops being appealing, regardless of how many times history shows that more is rarely true. Here's the question hiding underneath this entire chapter, the one worth carrying forward into everything that follows, even 500 monks, people who had already proven they could choose difficulty over comfort once, could be misled by a counterfeit dressed up as superior rigor. What protection does an ordinary person actually have against the same trap? The answer is not more willpower. It is not trying harder to detect counterfeits through sheer determination. The answer has more to do with who is willing to walk quietly into the middle of a crisis like this one, not to condemn, not to shame, but simply to reason patiently with people who are still, underneath their confusion, not capable of seeing clearly again. Before we follow two men into the forest to face down a schism that has already pulled 500 practitioners away from the narrow road, it's worth pausing on something that happened centuries later, far from any monastery. That shows exactly how long this same pattern keeps repeating itself in human history. 3 centuries after these events, a king named Ashoka would inherit an empire built on conquest and would, after a single devastating war, turn away from everything that had made him powerful and toward exactly the kind of unglamorous, narrow discipline this story has been describing all along. We are not at that part of his story yet. But hold him in mind as we watch what's about to happen here, because the same forces pulling at 500 monks in a forest were, 300 years later, still pulling at an emperor surrounded by an entire court invested in his staying exactly as he was. Now, back to the forest, and to 2 men the Buddha chose for an unusual mission. Their names were Sariputta and Moggallana, and among the Buddha's closest disciples, they were known for 2 very different strengths. And Sariputta was called the foremost in wisdom, a mind capable of untangling complicated philosophical confusion with patient, careful precision. Moggallana was called the foremost in psychic power, a man whose attainments were, by the accounts of his contemporaries, formidable enough that people sometimes mistook capability for authority, force for persuasion. It is worth knowing where these 2 men came from, because their friendship predates everything this story has shown you so far. They had been close friends since childhood, both born into wealthy families, both having walked away from comfortable lives in a shared search for truth long before either of them met the Buddha. They had made a pact as young men that whichever of them found genuine liberation first would immediately tell the other. A pact built on a friendship too honest to let personal achievement become a private possession kept from someone they cared about. Sariputta found the teaching first, through a chance encounter with one of the Buddha's earliest disciples, and kept his promise immediately, bringing Moggallana to the same teaching within days. This is the kind of relationship fit the 2 of them brought into the forest that day. Not strangers cooperating on an assignment, but 2 men whose entire friendship had been built around exactly the values this counterfeit movement had abandoned. This is exactly why their mission is worth paying close attention to, and because of what they chose not to do with those gifts. When word reached the Buddha that 500 monks had followed Devadatta away from the community, convinced his 5 stricter rules represented a truer, harder path, he sent these 2 disciples after them. Not to fight, not to perform a display of psychic power that would intimidate or overwhelm the misled monks into submission. Not even at first, to argue directly against Devadatta's authority. He sent them to teach. You should picture the specific scene that followed, because the texts preserve it with unusual stillness for an episode this consequential. And Sariputta and Moggallana walked for several days to reach the forest community Devadatta had established, arriving in the late afternoon when the light had already gone soft and gold across the trees. They did not arrive with any visible urgency, no sign that they had come to contest anything. They simply asked with ordinary courtesy and whether they might rest there a night and join the evening gathering, exactly the kind of unremarkable request that gave Devadatta no reason for suspicion and every reason for pride. Sariputta and Moggallana arrived at the forest community Devadatta had built, and Devadatta, by every account preserved of this moment, welcomed them warmly, apparently believing their arrival meant his new movement was gaining respected converts from the Buddha's own inner circle. He asked Sariputta to address the assembled monks while he rested. You should understand why Devadatta felt so secure leaving Sariputta unsupervised with his own followers, because his confidence here is itself revealing. He had, by this point, convinced himself so completely of his own movement's superiority that the possibility of his followers being persuaded back toward the original teaching simply did not occur to him, as a realistic threat. This is one of the quieter, more universal dangers of Adimana this story keeps returning to. Once a person becomes convinced their own path is not merely valid but superior, they often stop guarding against the possibility that the original, less impressive-looking path might still hold something true enough to win followers back. Here's the detail easy to miss, the kind of detail that explains everything about how the real narrow road eventually exposes a counterfeit. Sariputta did not stand up and denounce Devadatta. He did not list his failures or attack his character. None. He simply began teaching the actual Dhamma, clearly, patiently, the same teaching these 500 men had originally ordained to learn before a more impressive-looking alternative pulled them away from it. And something began to happen in that assembly that Devadatta had not anticipated. As Sariputta spoke, explaining, with the same patient clarity that had once helped him understand the teaching himself, what genuine liberation actually requires and why external austerity alone, however impressive, cannot manufacture internal freedom. The fog the texts call moha began, for some of those listening, to lift, not all at once, not for everyone in the room, but for enough of them that something shifted in the gathered crowd. You should picture the particular quality of that shift, because it did not happen through any single dramatic argument. Sariputta did not present a clever rebuttal of Devadatta's 5 rules. He simply returned patiently, most basic questions any of these men had once asked themselves before ordaining at all, what they were actually seeking, what suffering actually was, what freedom from it would actually feel like, stripped of any comparison to how committed it might look to an outside observer. As he spoke, monk after monk in that gathered assembly found themselves quietly returning, in their own minds, memories of why they had first left ordinary life, memories that had, almost without their noticing, been buried under months of competitive austerity and private anxiety about whether their own sacrifice measured up to everyone else's. The teaching did not give them new information. It gave them back access to information they had always had, before ambition and conformity had quietly covered it over. Stay with this moment because it's the answer to the question the last chapter left hanging. What protects an ordinary person against a counterfeit dressed up as superior rigor? Not louder argument, not a more impressive display of force or power. Simply patient, clear exposure to the actual truth, given room to do the slow work it does inside a mind that has not entirely lost the capacity to recognize it. One by one, monks in that assembly began to remember what they had actually been seeking when they first ordained. Not a reputation for extreme austerity, not proximity to a teacher who promised them they were exceptional, but freedom from the very craving and aversion that Adimana had quietly disguised itself as transcending. By the time Sariputta finished speaking, a great majority of the 500 had decided to return to the Buddha's community. You should sit with how this actually happened, because it corrects something the wide road wants you to believe about itself. That once someone has been pulled in, the pull is permanent. That conviction this strong cannot be undone by anything except an equally forceful counter-conviction. It is not true the fog can lift. People caught inside a counterfeit, dressed up however convincingly as the real thing, can still recognize truth when it is patiently, clearly placed back in front of them. Devadatta, waking to discover his movement had collapsed in his absence, did not respond with reflection. The texts describe his anger as severe enough that something in his own body failed him in that moment. Accounts differ on the precise details, but they agree on the underlying picture. A man whose entire identity had become tied to being recognized as exceptional could not survive the collapse of that recognition with any grace at all. You should sit with the specific shape of that collapse for a moment, because it tells you something true about every counterfeit movement built the way his was built. The structure had never had anything underneath it except his own need to be seen as more advanced than everyone around him. And when the followers who confirmed that need walked away, there was nothing left to hold. No genuine realization to fall back on. No quiet personal practice sustaining him independent of the audience he had built to witness it. And this is, in the end, the clearest possible difference between Visakha's kind of devotion, which you will meet several chapters from now, and Devadatta's kind of ambition. One requires no witnesses to remain intact, and the other cannot survive losing them. Here's what 500 monks discovered in the end, exactly when they needed to discover it. The road that demanded more visible sacrifice had never actually been harder in the way that matters. It had been louder. It had been more impressive to look at. But the genuine narrow road, unglamorous, patient, unconcerned with how rigorous it appeared to outside observers, was the one that had actually been asking the deeper, harder thing of them all along. Not to look honestly at their own minds rather than at how committed their robes and alms bowls made them appear. This is the Pali pairing worth holding here, because it names exactly what shifted in that forest assembly. Ekadithi, wrong view, a map that points confidently toward the wrong destination, and Samadhithi, right view, seeing clearly even when that clarity is unpopular, even when it requires admitting you have, for a time, been walking the wrong road with total conviction. The 7th century Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, traveling through India centuries after these events, recorded observations of competing religious communities still operating side by side at sites connected to the Buddha's life, some thriving for generations on careful, unglamorous practice, others rising quickly around charismatic figures and dissolving almost as fast once that figure's authority collapsed or was exposed. The pattern this chapter has just shown you did not end with Devadatta. It simply kept finding new costumes to wear. You should know a little of what Xuanzang actually documented during his travels. Because his notes read almost like a field study, confirming this video's central thesis centuries before the thesis had been named. He described monasteries that had endured for hundreds of years, their daily routines barely distinguishable from descriptions of monastic life recorded generations earlier, the same unglamorous schedule of study, meditation, and alms round, sustained by communities that needed no audience to keep practicing. He also described in the same regions the abandoned remains of once prominent religious movements built around individual charismatic teachers, their buildings crumbling, their teachings remembered only as cautionary footnotes by the monks who had outlasted them. The contrast was, by his own account, and striking enough to comment on directly, a landscape literally littered with the physical evidence of which kind of road actually survives contact with time. Before we follow this story forward, toward darker consequences still waiting in the palace. If a story like this one is helping you see patterns more clearly in your own life, the kind of false conviction traps that look more impressive than the truth, now consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it too. For now, notice what this chapter has actually proven, underneath the specific drama of monks and forests and rival teachers. The antidote to a convincing counterfeit was never force, and it was never volume. It was simply someone patient enough to stand in front of confusion and speak the truth clearly, and without needing the moment to be dramatic in order to be effective. This is worth carrying forward as its own small, durable lesson, separate from everything else this chapter has shown you. Next time you encounter a conviction loud enough to feel unanswerable, remember that patience, not louder argument, has historically been the thing that actually dissolves it. Not everyone caught in this story's unfolding crisis got to hear that patient truth in time. Back in the palace, a young prince's doubt about his father is about to become something the texts can no longer describe gently, and you have now watched a counterfeit collapse under the weight of patient truth, and you've seen 500 men find their way back to the road they had nearly abandoned. But there is a different kind of test waiting in this story now. Not a test of recognizing a counterfeit teaching, but a test of whether any teaching, true or false, can survive contact with the worst thing that can happen to a human being in a single day: Her name was Patakara, and before grief found her, she had what most people in her world would have called a fortunate life, and she had married against her family's wishes a servant in her father's household, a man well beneath her family's social standing, chosen not for status but for something closer to genuine affection, the kind that made her willing to leave behind wealth and family approval for a much simpler life with him. They had built a modest household together, a kind of ordinary domestic happiness that rarely gets recorded in any detail precisely because nothing about it seemed remarkable while it was happening. She was, by every account that survives, content in a way that had nothing to do with the comfort she had given up to find it. She was married to a man she loved. She had children. She had parents who were alive and well, living not far from her own household. None of this protected her from what was coming. And it's worth saying clearly, before this story goes further, nothing protects anyone from what was coming. That is precisely the point her story is about to make. You should know what happened to her plainly without softening it, because softening it would betray exactly what she had to face without softening. While traveling to visit her parents with her husband and 2 children, Patakara's husband was killed by a snake bite on the road. In the chaos and grief of that moment, while she carried her children alone trying to reach safety, a swollen river claimed her younger child, swept from her arms in the current. Her older child, holding her hand, was then taken by a bird of prey while she searched frantic for the first child the river had already taken. In a single day, she lost her husband and both of her children. You should let the geography of that day sink in for a moment, because the texts are precise about it in a way that makes the horror feel even more unbearable than a vague summary allows. The snake bite happened on a riverbank path in the late morning. The river crossing, and swollen from recent rain, happened within the same hour, while she was still trying to process what had just happened to her husband's body behind her. The bird took her older child while she stood at the water's edge, and, scanning the current for any sign of the younger one, her back turned for what could not have been more than a few minutes. Every single loss happened within sight or near sight of the loss before it. No space between catastrophes large enough to even begin absorbing one before the next one arrived. She continued toward her parents' house anyway, not because grief that total does not always announce itself immediately. Sometimes it numbs first and breaks later. When she arrived, she learned that a storm the previous night had collapsed the house, killing both of her parents and her brother inside it. You do not need any teaching, any philosophy, any Pali word at all to understand what this did to her. Patakara lost her mind in the most literal sense the texts allow. She tore at her clothing. She wandered, half-dressed, through villages, speaking to no one, recognized by no one, until people began to throw rubbish at her, assuming her madness made her dangerous or unclean. And you should understand what those weeks of wandering actually looked like for her, because the texts do not soften the duration of her unraveling. She walked for what is described as a considerable stretch of time, sleeping wherever exhaustion finally caught her, eating only what she stumbled across or what occasional pity offered before fear of her madness made even that rare. She spoke, when she spoke at all, in fragments that made sense only to her, addressing her dead children as though they were still walking beside her, asking strangers if they had seen a particular small sandal she remembered her younger child wearing. Questions that made listeners recoil rather than answer, mistaking the specific, devastating coherence of grief for incoherence itself. This is worth sitting with honestly. From the outside, total grief and madness can look identical, and the difference between them is not always visible to the people standing nearby, deciding whether to help or simply look away. And here's the part nobody tells you about a grief this total. It does not respect any of the categories people normally use to make suffering bearable. There was no lesson available to her in this moment, no perspective that could have made any of it acceptable. If a teaching cannot survive contact with grief like this, it has no business calling itself a path to liberation at all. She eventually wandered, still in this broken state, into a place where the Buddha was teaching. Some accounts describe people trying to keep her away, ashamed of her appearance and her madness. The Buddha did not allow that. He addressed her directly, bluntly, and something in his presence, not magic, not a miracle cure for grief, but a steadiness that did not flinch from the size of what she carried, allowed her for the first time since the river took her child, actually hear words spoken to her. You should picture the reaction of the gathered crowd in that moment, and because it tells you something about how differently this teacher handled exactly the kind of spectacle this entire video opened by warning you against. A disheveled, half-dressed, visibly distraught woman wandering into a teaching is the kind of disruption most gatherings, religious or otherwise, instinctively move to remove. No, protecting the dignity of the occasion over the dignity of the person disrupting it. The Buddha did the opposite, without drama, without making her humiliation into a lesson for everyone else watching. He simply turned his full attention toward her, treating her arrival not as an interruption to manage, but as the actual reason the gathering existed in the first place. He told her that the tears she had cried across countless lifetimes, for countless losses like this one, were greater in volume than all the water in all the oceans of the world. He was not minimizing her grief. Nay, he was placing it inside something larger, not to make it smaller, but to show her she was not uniquely cursed, not specially targeted by misfortune, but caught inside a condition every being caught in this cycle of existence eventually faces in some form. You should picture the exact moment this landed, because the text suggests it happened gradually rather than all at once. She did not stop weeping the instant she heard this. She continued for some time, the words simply present alongside her grief rather than immediately replacing it. But something in the framing began, almost imperceptibly, not shift the shape of what she was carrying, not the weight of it, which remained as total as it had been, but the isolation surrounding that weight. She had been grieving not only her own losses, but the specific, private conviction that no grief had ever been this large, that she alone had been singled out by some particular cruelty in the universe. Hearing that this exact devastation, in one form or another, had visited every being in this endless cycle of birth and loss, did not make her son any less dead. It simply made her, for the first time since the river took him, slightly less alone inside that fact. Notice what just happened in this moment, because it matters for understanding why the narrow road can hold weight the wide road cannot. The wide road, faced with grief this total, would have nothing honest to offer. It could only distract, numb, or promise an impossible reversal, bring back what was lost, undo what cannot be undone. The narrow road offered her something different, not a reversal, but a reframing large enough to actually hold what had happened to her without lying about its size. This is the Pali word worth sitting with here. The defilements, the inner residue of craving, aversion, and delusion that the easy path never asks anyone to clean, because cleaning it requires exactly the kind of unflinching honesty Patakara was now being asked to bring to her own devastated mind. Her grief was real, her loss was real. But underneath the grief, the Buddha was pointing towards something else. The deeper attachment to permanence, to the idea that the people we love can be held on to forever, that was now being tested in the most brutal way a human mind can be tested. It is worth being precise about what this word does not mean, because it would be easy to hear defilements and assume the teaching was suggesting her grief itself was somehow impure or shameful. It was not. Kisa does not refer to love, no, or to the pain of losing what you love. Both of those remain, in this tradition, entirely natural and entirely appropriate responses to loss. What Kisa refers to is something more specific. The additional layer of suffering built on top of natural grief by the mind's insistence that permanence was ever actually promised. At loss, this total constitutes a unique injustice rather than a universal vulnerability every living thing shares simply by virtue of loving anything at all. Padakara's path forward did not require her to stop loving her children. It required her, eventually, to stop adding the second avoidable layer of suffering that comes from believing love should have guaranteed their safety. And she did not heal instantly. There was no single sentence that undid what had happened to her, but something in her began, slowly, to recover its clarity, and she eventually asked to be ordained as a nun. What happened next is worth pausing on because it directly answers something this entire story has been building toward across these chapters now. Can someone broken this completely actually walk the narrow road? Or is it reserved for people whose lives have not yet been shattered past repair? Padakara did not simply survive her ordination. She became one of the most respected teachers among the early Buddhist nuns, eventually credited in the tradition's later texts with helping many other women, several of whom had also lost children, find their way through grief that the wide road had no honest answer for. Her own verses, preserved in a collection of poems by early enlightened nuns, describe washing her feet one evening and watching the water trickle down a slope, then disappear into the earth, and recognizing in that small, unremarkable moment the same impermanence that had taken everyone she loved, now visible in something as ordinary as water running off her own skin. You should know what her later teaching actually looked like in practice. Because it shows you something important about how grief, once walked through rather than avoided, can become a particular kind of skill. Women in similar devastation began seeking her out specifically, sensing correctly that a teacher who had only read about loss could never meet them where they actually were. She did not offer them quick comfort. She sat with them, often in silence first, before saying anything at all, having learned, the hard way, exactly how useless words are in the earliest hours of a grief that size. Several of these women, the text's note, went on to reach the same clarity she had reached, walking the identical road from devastation to teaching that she herself had walked, simply because someone had finally been honest enough with them not to promise a shortcut around it. And it is worth sitting with how strange it is that this particular, unremarkable image, water disappearing into dry ground after an ordinary evening wash, became the moment everything finally settled in her, rather than some grander, more dramatic realization arriving with more obvious significance. This is perhaps one of the quietest and truest things this entire story keeps demonstrating. Narrow Road's most important moments rarely arrive wrapped in any drama proportional to their importance. They arrive instead in exactly the kind of small, easily overlooked instant that a less attentive mind would have let pass completely unnoticed, the way that same water disappearing into the ground would have for almost anyone else washing their feet that same evening, meant absolutely nothing at all. Here's where it gets remarkable, and it's worth holding on to as the central image of this chapter. The same impermanence that destroyed her family was, years later, the very thing that finally set her mind free, not because the impermanence had changed, but because her relationship to it had. Grief had once been something happening to her entirely outside her control, devastating and senseless. Eventually, it became something she understood clearly enough to stop fighting, which is not the same thing as no longer caring. It is something harder and quieter than that. And you should notice something about where this chapter has taken the larger pattern this entire story is built around. The earlier chapters showed you crowds drawn to spectacle, monks drawn to counterfeit rigor, a prince drawn to flattering ambition. Padakara was not drawn toward anything. She was broken open by circumstance entirely outside her choosing, and the narrow road was the only path honest enough to meet her there without flinching or lying to her about what had happened. This is perhaps the deepest difference between the wide road and the narrow one that this story has shown you so far. The wide road needs you to come to it voluntarily, drawn by something appealing, comfort, belonging. the promise of being exceptional. The narrow road does not require that you arrive willingly. It only requires that, once you arrive, however broken, you are willing to look honestly at what is actually there. 9. Keep Padakara's image in mind. Water trickling off her feet, disappearing into the ground, because it will return again later in this story, at a moment when someone else, in a very different setting, finally understands the same thing she understood that evening. For now, we have to return to the palace, where a doubt planted several chapters ago has been quietly growing into something the texts will no longer be able to describe gently. You have just watched grief total enough to break a mind sane again on the other side of it. Now this story has to return to something it left carried several chapters ago, a doubt growing quietly inside a palace, and a question this whole video keeps circling back to: what happens when ambition, not grief, and finally gets what it has been patiently waiting for. But before we go back to that palace, you need to meet one more person. A woman whose relationship to the easy road looked nothing like the village crowds, nothing like Devadatta's either. Her name was Ambapali, and she was a courtesan in the city of Vasali, famous enough that her mango grove had become one of the most celebrated properties in the region. You should understand what that fame actually meant in her world. It meant beauty treated as a kind of capital. It meant comfort, luxury, the attention of powerful men, and a life built almost entirely around being looked at. It is worth knowing what an ordinary day looked like for her at the height of that fame, because it makes her later decision land with more weight. And mornings spent with attendants preparing her appearance for visitors who would arrive throughout the day. Generals, merchants, visiting nobility, each treating an audience with her as a kind of status in itself. Her mango grove had become so renowned that travelers passing through Vasali would ask after it, specifically the way travelers ask after famous monuments, and she had grown so accustomed to being the most interesting thing in any room she entered that she had, by her own later admission, nearly forgotten what it felt like to enter a room and not be the center of it. For years, this was simply her life, and there is no reason to imagine she experienced it as a tragedy while she was living it. The wide road, remember, is not a road of obvious villains. It is a road built from real pleasures, real comforts, things that genuinely feel good in the moment you're experiencing them. Ambapali's years of beauty and luxury were not fake. They were real, and for a long time they were enough. And when the Buddha came to stay in her mango grove, she did something that surprised everyone who knew her reputation. She did not approach him the way the crowd once approached the fire trick teacher, hungry for spectacle. She listened, and what she heard in that quiet, unglamorous teaching was something her entire life of being celebrated for her beauty had never given her. A clear, calm description of exactly why beauty, however genuine its pleasures, could never be the thing that actually protected her from suffering. And you should understand what made this particular teaching land so differently for her than it might have for someone else hearing the identical words. And she had spent her entire adult life surrounded by men telling her how extraordinary, how singular, how irreplaceable her beauty made her. The Buddha's teaching offered her, for perhaps the first time, an honest description of impermanence that did not flatter her into believing she was somehow exempt from its reach. And there was something almost relieving, rather than insulting, in finally being told the truth plainly by someone who had nothing to gain from flattering her further. She gave her grove to the Sangha, not because her life had collapsed the way Padakara's had. Nothing forced her hand. She simply heard something true clearly enough that the wide road she had been walking, comfortably, for years, suddenly looked smaller than it had looked the day before. You should know how this offer was actually received, because it complicates any simple version of this story. When word spread that she intended to donate her famous grove, several wealthy noblemen who had long competed for her attention raced their chariots toward the grove themselves, hoping to make a competing offer to the Buddha first and claim the honor of hosting him instead. A final, now almost comic echo of the very dynamic her donation was quietly stepping away from. Men still competing for status and recognition even as she had already stopped needing either. The Buddha accepted her offer over theirs, not as an insult to wealthy donors, but simply because her gift had been given first freely, without any of the competitive performance still driving the men now racing toward the same grove. Here's the question hiding underneath her story, worth sitting with for a moment. You don't need your life to fall apart before you can recognize the narrow road. Sometimes it only takes one clear, quiet teaching, heard at the right moment, to make years of comfortable habits suddenly visible for what it actually was. You should know what happened to Ambapali afterward, because her story does not end with the donation alone. She eventually ordained as a nun herself, and her own verses, preserved alongside Padakara's in the same collection of early enlightened nuns' poetry, describe looking at her own aging body, the same body that had once been celebrated across an entire region for its beauty, and recognizing without bitterness exactly how completely that beauty had already begun dissolving. Hair that had once been compared to black bees now thin and gray, skin once praised by poets now creased and spotted. She wrote about this transformation not as tragedy but as confirmation. The very impermanence that had eventually made her beauty fade was the same impermanence the Buddha had once pointed her toward. In that mango grove, years before age made the lesson impossible to ignore. Now, finally, let's go back to that palace. 3 centuries before any of these recorded events, a man would be born who would inherit one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen, and built almost entirely through conquest, and his name was Ashoka. We touched on him earlier in this story, and now it's time to understand exactly what happened to him, and because his transformation answers something Ambapali's quieter shift could not fully answer on its own. What happens when the person walking away from the wide road has more to lose than almost anyone in history? And Ashoka came to power through a war of succession brutal enough that later accounts describe him eliminating rival brothers without hesitation. He expanded his empire aggressively, and the campaign that finally broke something open in him was his conquest of a kingdom called Kalinga. The battle, by his own later account, left so many dead and wounded that the scale of it became impossible for him to look away from, the way he had looked away from every previous conquest. None. You should understand what made Kalinga different from every battle before it, because the difference is the entire hinge of this man's transformation. Kalinga was not a quick victory. Resistance there was fierce and prolonged, and the casualties by the numbers later inscribed at his own order ran into the hundreds of thousands between deaths and deportations. Numbers large enough that even a king accustomed to conquest could no longer process them as mere statistics of a successful campaign. And Ashoka is said to have walked the battlefield himself afterward, something he had apparently never bothered to do after previous victories. And what he saw there, bodies extending further than he could comprehend, and survivors searching among the dead for people who would never be found. The particular silence of a place that has just finished destroying itself did something none of his earlier conquests had managed to do. It made the abstraction of victory suddenly unbearably concrete. Here's what almost nobody tells you about this turning point, because it gets simplified in retellings into a single dramatic moment of conscience. It was not instant and it was not clean. Ashoka did not wake up the next morning a changed man. He spent time, months by most accounts, sitting with what he had done, the way Padakara had to sit eventually, with what had happened to her family, before either of them could move forward into something honest. What he eventually chose was almost unthinkable for a ruler of his time and power. He turned away from further military expansion and toward something closer to the narrow road this entire video has been describing: restraint, ethical governance, support for religious tolerance across his empire, our public commitments to nonviolence carved permanently into rock, where his own subjects could read them for centuries after his death. You should consider how genuinely unusual this choice was, and against the entire pattern of how empires in his era typically behaved. Conquest in the ancient world was rarely questioned once achieved. It was simply absorbed into the ordinary business of statecraft, and its human cost treated as an unavoidable feature of expansion rather than something requiring ongoing moral accounting. Ashoka's decision to treat his own conquest as something requiring continued public reckoning rather than something to be quietly absorbed and moved past had almost no precedent among rulers of comparable power before him. He was not simply choosing mercy going forward. He was choosing to keep the cost of his past cruelty visible permanently, in a way that made forgetting it impossible for himself or for anyone who came after him. You should understand how strange this looked from inside his own court. Generals who had built their careers and their fortunes on continued conquest did not celebrate this transformation. Advisors who had profited from an aggressive, expansionist state did not quietly accept a king who now spoke about compassion toward conquered peoples and restraint in the use of force. There was resistance, real and ongoing, from people whose entire position depended on Ashoka remaining the man he had been before Kalinga. You can imagine the specific shape of conversations happening in his court during this period. Generals arguing that neighboring kingdoms, sensing weakness, would soon test borders that conquest alone had always reliably secured. And treasury officials warning that an empire which stopped expanding would eventually stop generating the tribute and plunder that had funded its administration for generations. Even members of his own family, by some accounts, suggesting privately that grief over Kalinga, however understandable, should not be allowed to reshape decades of established imperial strategy. Ashoka heard all of this by every account that survives and continued anyway. Not loudly contesting each objection, but simply steadily continuing to govern according to the new commitments he had made, regardless of how many people around him quietly disagreed. And notice something important here, because it connects directly back to Bimbisara's story many chapters ago. Choosing the narrow road, even from a position of immense power, does not make resistance disappear. It often increases it, because the people most invested in the old comfortable arrangement are usually the people closest to you, the people with the most to lose if you actually change. This is where Ashoka's rock edicts become worth bringing in directly. In his own words, carved into stone across his empire, he describes his regret over the suffering caused by his earlier campaigns and his commitment to governing through Dhamma rather than through force. These are not later legends written by admirers. They are his own recorded words, left deliberately where his own people could read them. An unusually public, permanent admission of having walked the wide road for years before choosing deliberately and visibly to leave it known. It is worth knowing what these edicts actually said in their own plain language, because the specificity matters more than the general idea of royal regret. One edict describes his sorrow over the people of Kalinga directly, naming the suffering of those who died, those who were separated from loved ones, and those left to grieve, in terms unusually personal for a ruler of his era to commit to permanent stone. And other edicts establish practical reforms: rest houses for travelers, wells dug along major roads, medical care extended to animals as well as people, instructions to his own officials to treat all his subjects, regardless of region or religion, with the same fairness. These were not abstract philosophical statements. They were administrative commitments, not carved where they could not quietly be revised or forgotten the way a private resolution so easily can be. Stay with this contrast for a moment because it's the strongest version of this video's central pattern you've seen yet. And Ashoka had every resource available to keep walking the wide road indefinitely. Unlimited power, total impunity. An empire that would have continued expanding under his leadership for as long as he wished. And he chose the narrow road anyway, against the active resistance of the very court built around him. And he chose it not because anyone forced him to, but because he had finally seen clearly enough what the wide road had actually cost. Keep that resistance in mind. We are not finished with what it eventually demanded of him. Now finally, the moment this story has been carrying since the chapter where Devadatta first found an ally in a doubting prince. Ajatasattu's quiet resentment toward his own father had by this point hardened past doubt into intention, and, with Devadatta's encouragement, accounts differ on exactly how active a role Devadatta played in what followed, though most agree he did nothing to discourage it. Ajatasattu imprisoned his own father, King Bimbisara, and ultimately caused his death, seizing the throne of Magadha for himself. You should know the specific, quiet cruelty of how this happened, because it tells you something about how resentment, once fully hardened, now stops needing dramatic violence to do its work. Ajatasattu did not have his father killed outright in a single decisive act. He had him imprisoned instead in a cell where, for a time, only his mother was permitted to visit, smuggling in small amounts of food hidden in her clothing because Ajatasattu had ordered that no food be brought to the king at all. When this was discovered and stopped, Bimbisara is said to have continued walking the length of his cell daily, a small, deliberate act of ordinary discipline maintained even there, until his son, learning of even this small remaining freedom, ordered the soles of his father's feet cut so that he could no longer walk. Bimbisara died not long after, weakened by imprisonment and deprivation rather than by any single violent blow. A death assembled slowly, through accumulated small cruelties, by a son who could not bring himself to end his father's life quickly even after deciding completely that it needed to end. You should feel the full weight of this, because it is the darkest moment this story has shown you so far. Bimbisara, the king who chose quiet, repeated conversation over comfortable religious establishment, who absorbed years of court mockery for his devotion, who built his entire later life on something patient and unglamorous, was killed by the resentment his own son had nursed, fed carefully by a man who had already proven with 500 monks exactly how convincingly counterfeit devotion can disguise itself as something higher. It is worth knowing, briefly, how the wider kingdom received this news because the silence surrounding it tells its own story. Few records survive of any immediate public outcry, any widespread protest against a son who had imprisoned and effectively killed a widely respected father. This, too, is a quiet confirmation of something this entire video has been describing from its opening scene. A population accustomed to associating strength with legitimate rule did not necessarily recognize in the moment that something deeply wrong had just occurred. Ajatasattu kept his throne. The kingdom largely continued its ordinary business. It would take years, by some accounts, for the weight of what he had done to surface even within his own conscience, let alone in any organized reckoning from the people he now ruled. Here's the part the texts do not let you avoid, and it matters for honesty's sake. Choosing the narrow road did not protect Bimbisara from this outcome. The narrow road was never a guarantee of safety, comfort, or a peaceful ending. It was, and remains, a guarantee of nothing except clarity about what is actually true, walked one honest step at a time, regardless of what eventually happens to the body carrying that clarity forward. This is something worth sitting with honestly before this story moves toward its climax. There is a version of teachings like this one that quietly promises you safety in exchange for virtue, that if you choose the narrow road, walk it faithfully, things will work out well for you in some recognizable worldly sense. Bimbisara's death is the clearest possible refutation of that promise, and it would be dishonest to soften it here just because it complicates the story's emotional arc. What the narrow road actually offers is something else entirely, and you are about to watch it tested in its hardest form yet. There is a particular kind of moment worth naming here directly, because it happens quietly, in private, far from any palace or monastery. The moment someone realizes they have spent years agreeing with people around them, not because they actually believed what those people believed, but because disagreement felt too costly, too lonely, too dangerous to risk. You may have had a moment like that yourself, at a family table, in a workplace, inside a friendship you maintained out of fear rather than genuine connection. Ajatasattu, in the privacy of his own conscience, would eventually face exactly this kind of moment too, though not yet. Now, you should know what later accounts suggest happened to him, years after the throne he had killed for finally became fully his. Several sources describe him visited by recurring, unbearable guilt, nightmares, not physical illness brought on by the weight of what he had done, an inability to find peace despite achieving exactly the position Devadatta had once promised would feel like everything he was missing. And some accounts describe him eventually seeking out the Buddha himself, years after his father's death, arriving not as the confident, ambitious prince who had once been so easily flattered, but as a man finally facing, not without any crowd to hide inside, the actual weight of what unexamined ambition had cost him. The throne, once seized, did not deliver the freedom from feeling small that Devadatta had implied it would. For now, you have watched a Korsan release a beautiful life the moment she heard something truer than beauty. You have watched an emperor turn from conquest after seeing, finally, what conquest actually cost. And you have watched a quiet, devoted king die at the hands of his own son's resentment, carefully cultivated by a man who had already shown this story exactly how far counterfeit conviction can travel before it runs out of road. It is worth pausing before this chapter closes on how differently each of these three figures arrived at their particular fate, and despite all three of them having genuinely encountered the same narrow road at some point in their lives. Ambapali's encounter led to release. Ashoka's led eventually to transformation. Bimbisara's led in the end, not to death at the hands of someone he loved. The narrow road, this story keeps insisting, has never promised that recognizing truth protects you from every form of worldly harm. What it has promised, consistently, across every figure this story has shown you so far, is something quieter and in some ways more demanding. The chance to meet whatever happens to you, release, transformation, or even death, with clarity rather than delusion standing between you and the actual shape of your own life. If a story like this one is making you think differently about certainty dressed up as virtue, and the subscribe button helps more people find their way here. And here's a question worth sitting with before we move forward. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you finally stopped agreeing with a crowd, not because you found the courage to argue, but because you simply stopped being afraid of disagreeing quietly? I'd love to hear about it. The road ahead gets harder before this story is finished, but it is about to show you something Bimbisara's death cannot show you on its own. What the narrow road actually looks like, decades later, once it has had enough time to prove what it was always quietly promising. You have watched a king die at his own son's hand, an emperor turn from conquest after seeing its true cost, and a courtesan release a beautiful life the moment she heard something truer than beauty. Now, this story has to go back to where it began, to a woman standing in a crowd, child in her arms, waiting for a fire trick teacher to notice her. You remember Kisa Gotami? We left her at the very start of this video, going door to door through her village, begging anyone for medicine that could undo what death had already finished. That search did not end the day we left her. It continued for some time after, growing more desperate, more frantic, as every door she knocked on offered the same useless combination of pity and helplessness. Eventually, someone she met along the way told her something different from what everyone else had been telling her. They told her there was a teacher, recently arrived, who might actually have the medicine she was looking for. You can imagine the hope that flared in her at those words, not because it is the same hope that drew that fire-trick crowd to the dusty road at the start of this story. The hope that someone, somewhere, has a shortcut around the unbearable thing you are facing. She went to find this teacher with her child still in her arms, certain, for the first time in days, that her search was finally about to end. The Buddha listened to her. He did not turn her away, and he did not tell her, immediately, the truth she was not yet ready to hear. Instead, he told her that there was indeed a medicine that could help, but it required one specific ingredient, gathered in one specific way, needed to bring him a handful of mustard seed. But the seed had to come from a household that had never experienced a death. Not a parent, not a child, not a spouse, a sibling, anyone at all. She set out immediately, certain this would be simple. Mustard seed was common, growing in nearly every household's garden. Surely, among an entire village, she would find at least one home untouched by loss. And you should picture the specific moment her certainty began to falter, because it did not collapse all at once. At the first few houses, she barely registered the answers people gave her. So confident was she that the next house, or the one after that, would finally be the exception she needed. By perhaps the 10th house, a small unease had begun to settle into her question, though she pressed forward anyway, telling herself this village had simply been unlucky in some unusual, temporary way. By the 20th house, the pattern had become impossible to dismiss as coincidence, and something in the rhythm of her own walking had begun to slow. The urgency of her search gradually replaced by something closer to recognition, arriving well before she could put words to what she was recognizing. And here's what most retellings of this story rush past too quickly, and it's worth slowing down for, because the slowness is the entire point. She went from house to house, exactly as she had done searching for a cure days earlier. Except this time she was asking a different question. Do you have mustard seed? Yes, of course. Has anyone in this house ever died? And at every single door the answer was yes. A parent, a child, a husband, a grandmother. House after house, the same seed freely offered, and the same quiet admission that loss had already visited there too. By the time she reached the edge of the village, she had gathered enough mustard seed to fill 100 bowls and had not found a single household untouched by death. You should picture a few of those specific doors because the text suggests she remembered them individually long after that day had ended. An elderly potter who handed her seed without being asked twice, then sat down heavily on his own doorstep and told her unprompted about a daughter lost to fever decades earlier, his voice still catching on, the telling despite all the years between. A young couple who gave her seed cheerfully at first, before the wife's face changed mid-sentence. None. Remembering a brother none of the neighbors had thought to mention because his death had happened so long ago it no longer seemed worth bringing up. A household where an old woman gave her seed in complete silence, offering no story at all, her face suggesting a loss too recent or too large to be spoken about to a stranger, even one who clearly understood loss as well as she did. Stay with this moment, not because it is doing something far more sophisticated than it first appears to be doing. The Buddha did not lecture her about impermanence from a position of distance. He did not simply tell her that everyone dies, that death is universal, that her grief was not unique, true statements that, spoken directly, she would likely have been too raw to actually hear. He sent her to discover it herself, door by door, in the words of people who had each carried exactly what she was now carrying. This is the Pali word worth holding here, tanha. Craving, specifically the thirst for things to be permanent that cannot be permanent. The wide road's foundational promise that this thirst can somehow be satisfied if you just find the right cure, the right teacher, the right shortcut. Kisa Gotami's search for medicine had been, underneath its specific grief, an expression of tanha in its rawest form. The demand that death simply not apply to her child, regardless of what applied to everyone else's. What that walk through the village actually dissolved was not her love for her son, not. It was the isolating belief that her loss was somehow uniquely unfair, that everyone else's house had somehow been spared what hers had not. By the time she returned carrying no medicine at all, something in her had already begun to change. She buried her child. She returned to the Buddha, and this time she was ready to actually hear what he had to teach, not as an abstract philosophy delivered to a stranger, but as something she had just walked house by house with her own feet. She eventually asked for ordination, and the tradition remembers her, generations later, not for her grief alone, but for the clarity she eventually reached on the other side of it. You should picture the specific shift in her, walking back from the burial toward the Buddha's teaching, because it is not the shift from devastation to acceptance that simpler retellings sometimes suggest. The devastation did not disappear. What changed was the isolation surrounding it, the conviction, finally released, that her grief was somehow uniquely cursed rather than simply terribly human. She arrived this second time, not asking for a miracle the way she had the first time, but ready to actually sit with a teaching that asked something harder of her than belief. It asked her to look clearly at exactly what had happened, without the cushion of believing she alone had been singled out for it. And here's the question hiding underneath her entire story, the one worth carrying forward into the rest of this video. The crowd in that opening scene wanted a cure that would simply remove their suffering instantly, without requiring them to look at anything uncomfortable along the way. Kisa Gotami got something different, not a cure, but a confrontation with the actual shape of her situation, walked slowly enough that she could finally understand it instead of merely surviving it. This is perhaps the clearest possible illustration this video has offered yet of the actual difference between the wide road and the narrow one. The wide road would have given her an easy answer immediately, a blessing, a ritual, a promise that her son's death meant something other than what it meant. The narrow road gave her nothing easy at all. It gave her a task that forced her, door by door, to discover the truth herself at exactly the pace she needed to discover it. The 5th century Chinese monk Faxian, traveling through India centuries after these events, recording what he found at Buddhist sites along his route, noted something worth bringing in here. The monastic communities that endured longest, generation after generation, were rarely the ones built around a single charismatic figure or a single dramatic miracle. They were the ones built on patient, repeated practice, sustained quietly by ordinary people who had each, in their own way, walked their own version of Kisa Gotami's village road. It is worth knowing a little more about what Faxian's journey actually involved, because the scale of his own undertaking mirrors the patience this entire story keeps returning to. He traveled for over a decade, crossing some of the harshest terrain of his era on foot, specifically to find and study original Buddhist texts and visit sites connected to the earliest history of the teaching, at a time when the journey itself carried enormous physical risk with no guarantee of survival, let alone success. He was not seeking spectacle. He was seeking accuracy patiently over years, in exactly the unglamorous spirit this entire video has been describing. A pilgrim whose own life's work quietly embodied the very distinction between wide road and narrow road that the monasteries he visited had been demonstrating for centuries before he arrived to record it. You should notice by this point in the story how many different doors this same teaching has walked through. A grieving mother, a startled charioteer, a curious king, a calculating merchant, a restless king with hard questions, 500 misled monks, a devastated nun who lost everyone in a single day, a courtesan who heard something truer than beauty, an emperor who finally saw what conquest cost. None of them arrived at clarity the same way. None of them were given an easy version of the truth. Each of them had to walk their own particular road at their own pace toward the same unglamorous destination. Keep all of them in mind, because this story is about to climb toward its hardest test yet. Not a test of recognizing counterfeit teaching, and not a test of surviving devastating grief, but a test of what the narrow road actually looks like when it is challenged directly by someone clever enough to attack it with logic instead of spectacle or grief. You have now walked through fire-trick crowds and counterfeit rigor, palace betrayal, devastating grief, and quiet release. But there is one more kind of test this story has not yet shown you. What happens when the narrow road is challenged not by spectacle, not by grief, not by ambition, but by someone genuinely clever, using logic itself as a weapon against it. This part of the story takes place generations after the Buddha's death, in a kingdom ruled by a Greek-descended king named Milinda, known to history by his Hellenistic name Menander, a ruler famous for his sharp mind and his appetite for philosophical debate. He had, by most accounts, defeated every religious teacher who came before his court, dismantling their positions with the kind of precise, merciless logic that leaves an opponent with nowhere left to stand. It is worth understanding what kind of king this actually was, because it shapes the stakes of what Nagasena was about to attempt. Melinda ruled a region where Greek philosophical training, inherited from the campaigns of Alexander generations earlier, had blended with local intellectual traditions to produce a court culture unusually serious about rigorous argument, unwilling to accept religious claims on the strength of tradition or authority alone. Teachers from multiple traditions had already come before him and left defeated, their positions unable to survive sustained cross-examination from a king trained specifically to find the unstated assumption hiding inside every confident claim. By the time Nagasena agreed to debate him, Melinda's reputation for this kind of demolition had spread widely enough that some monks reportedly advised against the meeting entirely, worried it would only provide the king with one more easy victory to add to his collection. A monk named Nagasena agreed to debate him anyway. You should understand what Nagasena was walking into, because it matters for what comes next. This was not a crowd gathered around fire, easily impressed by spectacle. This was not a court full of advisors invested in maintaining a comfortable arrangement. This was a single, brilliant mind trained specifically to find the weak seam in any argument and pull until the whole structure came apart. It is worth knowing what Nagasena's own preparation for this debate actually looked like, because nothing about his approach suggests overconfidence. He did not arrive with a rehearsed set of clever rebuttals memorized in advance, the way a debater anticipating specific objections might prepare. He arrived, on most accounts, simply having spent years in the kind of patient study and meditation that leaves a mind clear enough to respond accurately to whatever actually gets asked, rather than to whatever was anticipated in advance. This distinction matters more than it first appears to. A mind stocked with prepared answers can be derailed the moment a question arrives that the preparation didn't anticipate. A mind made genuinely clear through years of practice can respond accurately to anything, because the clarity itself is the preparation, rather than any specific memorized content sitting on top of it. Melinda opened with a question designed to dismantle the entire premise of Nagasena's existence as a monk. If there is no permanent self, no unchanging soul moving through this life into the next, then who exactly is Nagasena? Who is sitting here, claiming to be a teacher, claiming to have a name, if the very thing that would anchor that name to a continuous person doesn't actually exist? Here's where it gets remarkable, and it's worth slowing down for, because Nagasena's answer is one of the oldest, most elegant pieces of reasoning preserved in this entire tradition. He asked the king, in return, how he had arrived at the debate that day. Melinda answered, by chariot. Nagasena began taking the chariot apart, piece by piece, in conversation. Is the wheel the chariot? No, said Melinda. Is the axle the chariot? No. The frame, the reins, the yoke? Each time, Melinda answered no, because each piece, examined alone, was clearly not the whole chariot. You should picture the room itself during this exchange, because the texts describe Melinda's court watching with the particular attentiveness of people who expected, based on every previous debate, to watch a teacher dismantled rather than vindicated. Melinda's own advisors leaned forward as the questioning continued, anticipating the moment Nagasena would either contradict himself or be forced to claim some mystical, unprovable essence to save his position. The kind of answer Melinda had heard from a dozen other teachers and dismissed easily each time. That moment never came. None. Each answer Nagasena gave was simple enough that a child could follow it, and precise enough that the king's sharpest advisors could find no seam to pull at. And yet Nagasena pointed out, and when all those pieces are assembled together, functioning together, moving together, we call the resulting thing a chariot. Not because some hidden, permanent chariotness exists separately from the parts, but because chariot is the name we give to a particular, functioning arrangement of parts, useful and real in exactly the way a name needs to be real, without requiring some unchanging essence underneath it. The same, Nagasena explained, is true of him. Nagasena is the name given to a particular arrangement of body, feeling, perception, thought, and consciousness, useful, functional, real enough to debate a king with, without requiring an unchanging soul hidden somewhere beneath all of it. Sit with this for a moment, because it answers something this entire story has been circling since its opening scene. The crowd gathered around the fire trick teacher wanted something solid to hold on to, a permanent cure, a permanent identity, a permanent escape from uncertainty. Nagasena's chariot shows you something the narrow road has been quietly insisting on this whole time, that you do not need permanence to have something real. A chariot works perfectly well without a hidden essence holding it together. A person can live, teach, debate kings, and walk an honest path without requiring an unchanging soul to make any of it meaningful. Think about what this actually offers you, sitting here 25 centuries removed from that debate. So much of the wide road's appeal depends on selling you a fixed, permanent identity. A final, a settled answer to who you are, who you have always been, who you will always be, an identity that, once purchased, never needs further examination. The narrow road offers something far less comforting, and this story has tried to show you again and again, far more durable. Not a fixed self to defend, but an honest, ongoing process of seeing clearly, moment by moment, without needing a permanent anchor to make that seeing worthwhile. The crowd will always prefer the comfort of a fixed identity. Nagasena's chariot suggests that comfort was never actually necessary to begin with. Melinda, by every account of this debate, did not walk away unconvinced through stubbornness. He recognized in real time that he had just watched logic itself. The very tool he had used to dismantle every previous teacher turned with complete precision toward an answer that held. It is worth knowing what happened after this exchange, because the texts do not simply end the story with a clever rebuttal landing successfully. Melinda, by several accounts, continued the conversation with Nagasena for days afterward, returning to question after question with the same rigor he had brought to every previous debate, no longer trying to dismantle the teaching, but genuinely trying to understand its full implications. This is, in its own way, the rarest outcome this story has shown you yet. Not a crowd converted by spectacle, not a counterfeit collapsing under exposure, but a single brilliant mind given every reason and every capability to find a weakness, choosing instead to keep asking sincere questions once it became clear no weakness was there to find. This is the Pali word worth sitting with here, panna. Wisdom, not specifically the kind of wisdom that does not collapse under genuine scrutiny because it was never built on spectacle or comforting illusion in the first place. The wide road's claims tend to dissolve the moment someone clever enough examines them closely. The narrow road's central insights, tested by one of the sharpest minds available in that era, held their shape. This is the kind of test the earlier chapters of this story have not shown you yet. Devadatta's counterfeit collapsed under patient exposure to simple truth. Ajatasattu's ambition collapsed eventually under its own weight. And Nagasina's teaching did not collapse under anything. It was examined directly by someone with every incentive and every capability to find its weakness, and it stood on. It is worth noting what this particular kind of durability actually proves, because it is easy to mistake surviving scrutiny for the same thing as surviving popularity, when the two are not remotely related. Many ideas that draw enormous crowds have never once been subjected to anything resembling Melinda's relentless cross-examination, and simply because crowds rarely demand that level of rigor from whatever has already won their enthusiasm. Nagasina's teaching earned its durability the hard way, tested by exactly the kind of mind least inclined to grant it any benefit of the doubt. This is perhaps the clearest answer this story has offered yet to the question every chapter has been circling, not whether something draws a crowd, and not even whether something survives a single dramatic confrontation, but whether it survives sustained, hostile, sincere examination from a mind genuinely trying to take it apart. Now, let's bring in someone whose entire life demonstrates the same durability in a completely different register. Not through clever debate, but through decades of quiet, unspectacular devotion. Her name was Visakha, and she had been, since girlhood, recognized as the foremost female lay supporter of the entire monastic community. What made her remarkable was not a single dramatic gesture, the way Anathapindika's land purchase or Ambapali's grove donation made for memorable single moments in this story. What made Visakha remarkable was consistency sustained across decades, not through marriage into a family that did not initially share her devotion, through the ordinary friction of running a large household, through years in which nothing dramatic happened at all. And you should know what that consistency actually required of her in practice, because the texts preserve enough specific detail to make it concrete. Her father-in-law, head of the household she married into, initially forbade any contact with the monastic community, considering it an embarrassing distraction from a wealthy family's proper concerns. Visakha did not argue with him loudly or defy him publicly. She simply continued, patiently finding small legal and ordinary openings to support the Sangha within the boundaries he set, answering his objections one at a time with calm reasoning rather than confrontation until, over years, not days, he came to respect the very practice he had once forbidden, eventually becoming a supporter himself. This is the specific, unglamorous shape patience took in her life. Not a single moment of victory, but years of steady, undramatic persistence that slowly moved an entire household's resistance without ever needing a dramatic confrontation to do it. This is not a criticism of dramatic generosity. It is simply a different register of the same underlying commitment, and worth naming clearly. The narrow road does not require a single defining moment of sacrifice. It can look for years at a time like nothing more than showing up, again and again with the same quiet attention, long after any crowd would have stopped watching closely enough to notice. Notice the contrast this builds by this point in the story, not between two very different kinds of endurance. Devadatta's movement, built on spectacle disguised as rigor, collapsed within a single chapter once exposed to patient truth. Visakha's devotion, built on nothing dramatic at all, simply continued, year after year, decade after decade, requiring no audience to sustain it and no exposure to threaten it, because there was nothing counterfeit underneath it that exposure could ever find. It is worth asking yourself, honestly, which kind of commitment you would have recognized more easily if you had been alive in either of their times, watching both unfold without knowing how either story would end. Devadatta's movement would have looked in its early months far more impressive than Visakha's quiet household devotion, more dramatic, more visibly rigorous, more obviously newsworthy to anyone passing through. This is precisely the trap this entire video has been describing from its opening scene. The wide road almost always looks more impressive in the moment you're standing closest to it. Only time, patiently allowed to pass, reveals which kind of commitment was actually built to survive it. This is not a story about who has the more impressive title, the louder argument, or the more visible devotion. This is not a story about which kind of commitment looks better from the outside. This is a story about which kind of commitment is actually built to last. And by this point in this story, you already know which one that is. Here's the question hiding underneath everything this story has shown you so far, the one worth carrying into its final climb. If the narrow road requires no spectacle to be real, no crowd to confirm it, no permanent self even to anchor it, what would it actually take for you to recognize it clearly in your own life? The next time the wide road shows up wearing one of its many convincing disguises. Before we climb toward the answer this entire video has been building toward, here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Most people watching a video this long have already shown you something about themselves. A willingness to stay with something difficult past the point where the wide road would have offered an easier exit. If that's true for you, the subscribe button helps more people find their way to a teaching like this one, the kind that asks more of you than 3 minutes of your attention. And here's a question worth sitting with, maybe the most personal one this story has asked yet. When was the last time you found yourself defending a belief, a habit, or a comfortable arrangement? Not because you'd actually examined it closely, but because examining it closely felt too costly. I'd love to hear that story below. 40 years are about to pass all at once in the next part of this story. And on a riverbank south of a great city, an old monk is finally going to sit down in the dust and refuse to move until his last question is answered. We are at last ready for him. You have walked through fire-trick crowds, counterfeit rigor, palace betrayal, devastating grief, and a debate that took apart the very idea of a permanent self. 40 years have now passed since the scene that opened this entire story, and it is time, finally, I'll return to the man we promised we would not forget. A riverbank south of a great city. The dust is the same color it always is in this part of the world, pale, fine, settling on everything it touches. An old monk sits down at the edge of the water and does not move. You should picture this scene the way someone passing by might have seen it without knowing anything of the 40 years behind it. An old man, alone, robes faded past any recognizable original color, sitting with the particular stillness of someone who has stopped performing stillness and simply become it. Fishermen working further down the bank glance at him occasionally without much curiosity. An old monk by the river is not an unusual sight in this region, and nothing about his posture suggests anything worth a second look. This is, in itself, worth noticing. The most significant moment in this entire 40-year story looked, to anyone passing, like absolutely nothing happening at all. You should understand who he is before this chapter tells you anything else, because the answer is not what most retellings of this story would lead you to expect. He is not famous. No crowd has ever gathered around him the way one gathered around the fire trick teacher at the start of this video. No king ever sought him out for counsel the way Pasenadi sought out the Buddha, or the way Melinda sought out Nagasena. For 40 years, he has lived almost entirely unnoticed, walking the same unglamorous practice this entire story has been quietly insisting matters more than spectacle ever could. He is the man with the cracked bow. You remember him, even if you didn't know until this moment that you were still carrying him. He walked past that fire trick crowd at the very beginning of this story, unremarked, uninteresting to anyone looking for something to be impressed by. He has spent the 4 decades since then doing something almost no one ever stopped to notice, practicing quietly, patiently, the same unspectacular discipline that every figure in this story eventually discovered was the only road that actually led anywhere real. 40 years is a long time to consider even in the abstract, let alone to actually live through one unremarkable day at a time. It is worth pausing on the sheer accumulated weight of that duration before this chapter moves forward. And every figure you have met across this story arrived at their own particular understanding through some specific, often dramatic catalyst. A debate, a devastating loss, a single clear teaching heard at exactly the right moment. This man's road offered him none of that. It offered him instead decades of ordinary mornings, ordinary alms rounds, ordinary sitting, with no single decisive event, marking the difference between not yet arrived and finally arrived. If this story has shown you anything by now, it is that this kind of road, lacking any dramatic marker, is in some ways the hardest one to walk. Precisely because it offers no obvious milestone, confirming that the walking is actually leading anywhere at all. Here's what nobody in that original crowd could have predicted, watching him disappear into the heat shimmer at the road's edge. He is, by this point in his life, deeply, completely free. Not free in the dramatic sense the wide road promises. Free from circumstance, free from difficulty, free from the ordinary friction of being alive in an aging body. Free in the deeper sense this entire story has been circling since its opening scene. Free from the grip of craving. Free from the fog of delusion. Free from the need for anyone at all to notice that he has arrived somewhere real. This is the Pali word worth holding here, the last one this story has been building toward. Nibbana. Not annihilation, not a void, not the absence of everything, but the actual extinguishing of the fires that built every wide road this story has shown you. The fire that drew a crowd to a counterfeit teacher, the fire of Adhimana that pulled 500 monks toward Devadatta, the fire of ambition that pulled Ajatasattu toward his own father's death, the fire of Tanha that sent Kisa Gotami door to door, and searching for an impossible cure. Every fire this story has shown you extinguished, not by force, not by suppression, but by finally seeing clearly enough that the fires no longer have anything left in the mind to feed on. It is worth being precise about what this word does not promise, because misunderstanding it is itself a kind of wide road, one that has misled curious newcomers for centuries. Nibbana is not described, in the earliest texts, as a blissful afterlife reward waiting at the end of sufficient suffering, nor as a permanent state of pleasant feeling replacing unpleasant feeling. It is described, more precisely, as the cessation of the very mechanism that made the distinction between pleasant and unpleasant feeling into a source of ongoing craving and aversion in the first place. The man at this riverbank was not necessarily experiencing constant euphoria in his final years. He was, by every account this tradition offers, simply no longer caught in the old machinery that once made every experience, not pleasant or otherwise, into fuel for further wanting. He has been sitting at this riverbank, the texts suggest, with one final question, not a question about doctrine, not a question that required debate or argument, but something closer to a private confirmation, the kind a person carries quietly for decades before finally asking it out loud to someone who can answer it directly. You should understand what kind of question this actually was, because it is not the kind of question that announces itself dramatically. After 40 years of patient, unglamorous practice, he had reached a point where he suspected, privately, that he had arrived somewhere real, that the craving which once drove every decision had genuinely quieted, that the aversion which once colored every difficulty had genuinely softened, that something in him had settled in a way that no longer required effort to maintain. But suspecting this about yourself, after a lifetime spent learning not to trust premature certainty, is its own kind of uncertainty. He did not need someone to grant him this attainment. He needed simply someone capable of recognizing it clearly enough to confirm what he had already quietly come to know. A teacher passing this way, generations after the Buddha's own death, stops, sits beside him, and listens to what he has been carrying. And here, finally, on this riverbank, after 40 years of practice, no crowd ever watched. And the old monk's last question is answered, and something in him settles completely. Notice what this resolution actually shows you. Because it is the entire point this video has been building towards since its opening image. The crowd at the start of this story wanted something immediate, visible, impressive enough to gather around. What this man received 40 years later was none of those things, and it was simply the quiet completion of a road he had been walking, unwatched for his entire adult life. Proof that the narrow road does not need an audience to be real and does not need speed to eventually arrive. And consider how completely this resolution refuses the wide road's most basic promise. The promise that arrival, when it finally comes, will feel like vindication in front of witnesses, like proof finally delivered to everyone who doubted you along the way. This man's arrival had no witnesses except a single passing teacher and a riverbank that did not care either way. There was no crowd waiting to confirm that his 40 years had been worth it. There was simply the thing itself finally settled, regardless of whether anyone besides him would ever know it had happened. This is perhaps the hardest single truth this entire story has asked you to sit with. Real arrival on the narrow road does not require anyone else's recognition to actually be real. This is not a story about a religion. This is not a story about rituals, robes, or temples. This is not a story about which teacher had the most impressive followers. This is a story about a single, now repeatable truth this video has shown you in a dozen different costumes. The wide road is wide because it asks nothing of you, and the narrow road is narrow because it asks for everything. Patience without applause, honesty without an audience, and the willingness to keep walking even when no one is watching closely enough to notice that you are. Before this story closes, there is one more piece of evidence worth bringing in, not from ancient texts this time, but from research conducted in the last few decades on people who have spent years walking exactly the kind of unglamorous, unwatched practice the man with the cracked bowl spent his life walking. Researchers studying long-term meditators, people with tens of thousands of hours of sustained, quiet practice, not weeks or months, have found measurable differences in how their brains process attention and emotional reactivity. Regions associated with sustained focus show denser, more efficient activity. Regions associated with reactive emotional flooding show reduced, more regulated response, even when these practitioners are deliberately shown distressing images during testing. None of this happened quickly. None of it happened because of a single dramatic breakthrough. It happened the same way the man at the riverbank's freedom happened. Slowly, unglamorously, accumulated one unwatched session at a time, over years. And it is worth naming what these studies actually involved, because the unglamorous nature of the methodology mirrors the unglamorous nature of the practice itself. Researchers did not look for a single moment of transformation. They tracked practitioners over years, sometimes decades, measuring small cumulative shifts that would have been invisible in any single session. Exactly the kind of gradual change that never makes for compelling spectacle, and exactly the kind of change the wide road has never had any mechanism for producing, because the wide road, by its nature, cannot sustain anyone's attention long enough to measure something that takes years to become visible. Compare this to what research on crowd-based, spectacle-driven movements consistently finds: rapid initial growth, intense early commitment, and then, with striking regularity, equally rapid decline once the founding figure's authority is questioned, exposed, or simply fades from novelty. The wide road's gains arrive fast and tend to evaporate just as fast. The narrow road's gains arrive slowly, and what arrives slowly, built without spectacle to begin with, has nothing left for exposure to take away. Centuries after the man at the riverbank, a forest monk in Thailand named Ajahn Chah would describe this same pattern in language a modern listener can hold on to easily. He taught repeatedly that peace comes not from forcing the mind into stillness through dramatic effort, but from letting go, a little at a time, patiently, the way you might loosen a fist finger by finger rather than trying to force it open all at once. He deliberately avoided the kind of fame that might have made his forest monastery into a spectacle. He wanted students who came for the practice, not for him. You should know how he actually structured the daily life of his forest monastery, because it reveals the same unglamorous pattern this entire story has been showing you across every century it has touched. Students who arrived expecting dramatic instruction were often given instead simple physical tasks, sweeping paths, carrying water, sitting in silence for hours, without any promised breakthrough scheduled to arrive on a predictable timeline. Many left disappointed and, having expected something closer to the fire trick teacher's promise of immediate visible transformation. The ones who stayed year after year, doing the same unremarkable tasks without any guarantee of when or whether clarity would finally settle, were the ones who eventually discovered exactly what the man at the riverbank had discovered, that the narrow road has never promised speed, only honesty, sustained for as long as honesty actually takes. This is not a story about strictness or rigor or sacrifice as proof of devotion. This is not a story about who walked the hardest road or made the loudest sacrifice. This is not even fundamentally a story about ancient India at all. This is a story about a pattern that has never stopped repeating. In every generation, in every crowd that gathers around something loud while a quiet, unremarkable person walks past unnoticed, and about the patient, unglamorous work required to notice the difference before the wide road has already cost you everything the narrow road might have given you instead. The old monk at the riverbank eventually stood and walked on, and the texts, true to the pattern this entire story has shown you, do not record where he went next or what became of him afterward. He did not need them to. He had already arrived somewhere no audience was required to confirm. There is something worth sitting with in this absence of a recorded ending, rather than treating it as simply an unfortunate gap in the historical record. No. A story built entirely around the dangers of needing an audience would have undercut its own lesson completely if it had insisted on giving this particular man a dramatic, well-documented final chapter. And his story ends exactly the way his 40 years of practice were lived, quietly, without ceremony, trusting that what was real did not require anyone's continued attention to remain real after he walked out of view. We have one more thing to ask of this story before we let it close. You have walked a very long road to get here. A fire trick crowd, a grieving mother with mustard seed in her hand, a charioteer who wept without understanding why, a king who chose quiet conversation over comfortable certainty, a merchant who spent a fortune on land for a homeless teacher, a counterfeit built from holier rules, 500 monks who found their way back, a woman who lost everyone in a single day and became one of the wisest teachers of her generation, a courtesan who gave away a beautiful life, an emperor who finally saw what conquest cost, a king who died at his own son's hand, a debate that took apart the idea of a permanent self, and a man with a cracked bowl who walked unwatched for 40 years towards something real. There is one more voice worth bringing into this story before it closes. Not an ancient one this time, but a modern scholar monk named Bhikkhu Bodhi, who has spent decades translating the earliest Buddhist texts directly from Pali into English, insisting, against considerable pressure, on precision over simplification. You should know what that insistence actually costs him in practice, because it is not an abstract principle but a daily set of small, unglamorous choices. Where a simpler translation might smooth over a difficult or ambiguous passage to make it more immediately accessible, he has consistently chosen to preserve the original difficulty, adding careful footnotes rather than convenient simplifications. Even knowing this makes his translations less immediately approachable than alternatives that take more liberty with the text. He has spent years on single difficult passages that a less careful translator might resolve in an afternoon, because the texts themselves, he has said, deserve a translator more committed to their accuracy than to their marketability. Here's what nobody tells you about the pressure he has faced and the kind of pressure this entire video has actually been describing since its opening scene. In a marketplace full of simplified, repackaged, easily marketable spirituality, meditation apps promising instant calm, retreats promising rapid enlightenment, teachers promising transformation in a single weekend, there is very little commercial incentive to insist on the slow, careful, unglamorous fidelity to what these texts actually say. The wide road, even now, 25 centuries later, still sells better than the narrow one. Bhikkhu Bodhi has spent his life on the narrow road anyway, choosing textual accuracy over the version of this teaching that might have reached a far larger audience far more quickly. You should notice by now that this is not a new problem. It is the same fire trick crowd wearing a different costume. It is the same 5 rules disguised as superior rigor, repackaged for an audience that no longer wears robes or lives in forests, but still in its own way, wants the appearance of depth without the patience depth actually requires. So here is what this entire story actually leaves you with. Not a single lesson, but 3, and the last one is the one worth carrying longest. The first is doctrinal, and it is the truth this whole video has been showing you from a dozen different angles. The wide road is wide because it asks nothing of you. It asks for no discipline, no patience, no honest look at your own mind. It only asks you to be drawn toward what is easy to see, easy to do, and easy to be praised for. The narrow road is narrow for the opposite reason. And it asks for everything. Patience without applause, honesty without an audience, discipline sustained long after anyone is watching closely enough to notice. Think back for a moment. Across everyone you've met in this story, notice how consistently this single distinction holds, regardless of how different each person's circumstances were. The fire trick teacher asked his crowd for nothing except belief, and delivered nothing except the temporary feeling of belief rewarded. Devadatta asked his 500 followers for visible sacrifice and delivered nothing except the temporary feeling of superiority that visible sacrifice produced. Every version of the wide road this story has shown you in every century it has appeared has followed the identical pattern. Ask for something cheap, deliver something that feels expensive, and count on the feeling lasting long enough that nobody notices the substitution until it is too late to matter. The second is personal, and it is harder to hear than the first. The size of the crowd around something has never once been evidence of its truth. 500 monks followed Devadatta and were wrong. No, a handful of monks stayed quiet beside the Buddha and were right. An entire court resisted Ashoka's change of heart, and Ashoka was the one who had actually seen clearly. Next time you find yourself reassured by how many people already believe something, remember that reassurance is not the same thing as truth, and it has never been. The third is the one this story has been building toward since its very first image, and it is, in the end, the only one that matters once everything else has been said. Somewhere right now, in a place no one is watching, someone is walking the narrow road exactly the way the man with the cracked bowl walked it, unnoticed, unapplauded, uncelebrated by any crowd at all. And that absence of an audience has never, not once, in 25 centuries of this same pattern repeating itself, made the road they were walking the wrong one. It might be worth asking gently whether that someone could be you in some particular corner of your own life right now. A quiet discipline you maintain without anyone noticing. A difficult honesty you practice without anyone applauding it. A small daily choice toward patience or restraint that will never make it into any story anyone tells about your life, and yet matters in the way that this entire video has tried to show you actually matters most. If something in you recognized itself, even briefly, in any of the figures this story has walked you through, that recognition is itself worth trusting more than any crowd's opinion ever could be. You have spent a long time with this story. That in itself says something about you worth naming, honestly. You are someone willing to sit with something difficult for longer than the wide road would have asked of you. If this story changed even slightly how you see the crowds in your own life, the ones you've followed, the ones you've resisted, not the ones you're still deciding about, that is worth more than anything this video could have told you in 3 minutes instead of 3 hours. So here is the question this story leaves you with, the one worth sitting with after the screen goes dark. Where, in your own life right now, are you mistaking a crowd for the truth? And what would it actually take for you to walk quietly in the other direction? Even if no one ever noticed you doing it, there is no need to answer that question quickly, and no need to answer it for anyone watching besides yourself. Man with the cracked bowl did not arrive at his own answer in an afternoon, and nothing about this story has suggested that you should expect to arrive at yours any faster than he did. What matters, this story has tried to show you again and again, is simply the direction you keep choosing, one ordinary day at a time, regardless of how loud the crowd gathered around the easier direction happens to be. If a story like this one is worth more people finding, the subscribe button helps it reach them. And if you've made it all the way here to the very end of this long road, I would genuinely love to know which moment in this story stayed with you the longest. Tell me below. The crowd will always be there, gathered around whatever is loudest. The road beside it, quiet and mostly empty, will always be there too. 25 centuries have passed since a man with a cracked bowl first walked past a fire no one could look away from. And the choice between those two roads has not changed once in all that time, regardless of how many new disguises the wide one has learned to wear. Walk it anyway.